Section 42 of The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 3, by James Boswell, Section 42. To Dr. Johnson. My dear Sir, I am in great pain with an inflamed foot, and obliged to keep my bed, so am prevented from having the pleasure to dine at Mr. Ramsay's to-day, which is very hard, and my spirits are sadly sunk. Will you be so friendly as to come and sit an hour with me in the evening? I am ever your most faithful and affectionate humble servant, James Boswell. South Audley Street, Monday, April the 26th. To Mr. Boswell. Mr. Johnson laments the absence of Mr. Boswell, and will come to him. Harley Street. He came to me in the evening, and brought Sir Joshua Reynolds. I need scarcely say that their conversation, while they sat by my bedside, was the most pleasing opiate to pain that could have been administered. Footnote. It is strange that he does not mention their visit in a letter in which he tells Temple that he is lame, and that his spirits sank to dreary dejection, and utters what the editor justly calls an ambiguous prayer: "Let us hope for gleams of joy here, and a blaze hereafter." This letter, by the way, and the one that follows it, are both wrongly dated. End of footnote. Johnson, being now better disposed to obtain information concerning Pope than he was last year, sent by me to my Lord Marchmont a present of those volumes of his Lives of the Poets which were at this time published, with a request to have permission to wait on him; and his Lordship, who had called on him twice, obligingly appointed Saturday the 1st of May for receiving us. On that morning Johnson came to me from Streatham, and after drinking chocolate at General Paoli's in South Audley Street, we proceeded to Lord Marchmont's in Curzon Street. His Lordship met us at the door of his library, and with great politeness said to Johnson, "I am not going to make an encomium upon myself by telling you the high respect I have for you, sir." Johnson was exceedingly courteous, and the interview, which lasted about 2 hours, during which the Earl communicated his anecdotes of Pope, was as agreeable as I could have wished. Footnote. Johnson's first question was, what kind of a man was Mr. Pope in his conversation? His Lordship answered that if the conversation did not take something of a lively or epigrammatic turn, he fell asleep, or perhaps pretended to do so. Johnson, in his Life of Pope, says that when he wanted to sleep he nodded in company. End of footnote. When we came out, I said to Johnson that, considering his Lordship's civility, I should have been vexed if he had again failed to come. "Sir," said he, "I would rather have given £20 than not have come." I accompanied him to Streatham, where we dined, and returned to town in the evening. On Monday, May the 3rd, I dined with him at Mr. Dilly's. Footnote. Boswell wrote to Temple late on this day, "Let us not dispute any more about political notions. It is now night. Dr. Johnson has dined, drunk tea, and supped with only Mr. Charles Dilly and me, and I am confirmed in my Toryism." End of footnote. I pressed him this day for his opinion on the passage in Parnell, concerning which I had in vain questioned him in several letters, and at length obtained it in due form of law. Case for Dr. Johnson's opinion, 3rd of May, 1779. Parnell, in his Hermit, has the following passage: "To clear this doubt, to know the world by sight, to find if books and swains report it right, for yet by swains alone the world he knew, whose feet came wandering o'er the nightly dew. Is there not a contradiction in its being first supposed that the hermit knew both what books and swains reported of the world, yet afterwards said that he knew it by swains alone? I think it an inaccuracy. He mentions 2 instructors in the first line, and says he had only 1 in the next." Footnote: "I do not," says Mr. Malone, "see any difficulty in this passage, and wonder that Dr. Johnson should have acknowledged it to be inaccurate. The hermit, it should be observed, had no actual experience of the world whatsoever. All his knowledge concerning it had been obtained in 2 ways, from books and from the relations of those country swains who had seen a little of it. The plain meaning, therefore, is to clear his doubts concerning Providence, and to obtain some knowledge of the world by actual experience, to see whether the accounts furnished by books or by the oral communications of swains were just representations of it. I say swains, for his oral or viva voce information had been obtained from that part of mankind alone," etc. The word alone here does not relate to the whole of the preceding line, as has been supposed, but by a common license to the words of all mankind, which are understood, and of which it is restrictive. Mr. Malone, it must be owned, has shown much critical ingenuity in the explanation of this passage. His interpretation, however, seems to me much too recondite. The meaning of the passage may be certain enough, but surely the expression is confused, and one part of it contradictory to the other. Boswell. This note is first given in the 3rd edition. End of footnote. This evening I set out for Scotland. To Mrs. Lucy Porter, in Lichfield. Dear Madam, Mr. Green has informed me that you are much better. I hope I need not tell you that I am glad of it. I cannot boast of being much better. My old nocturnal complaint still pursues me, and my respiration is difficult, though much easier than when I left you in the summer before last. Mr. and Mrs. Thrale are well. Miss has been a little indisposed, but she has got well again. They have, since the loss of their boy, had 2 daughters, but they seem likely to want a son. I hope you had some books which I sent you. I was sorry for poor Mrs. Adie's death, and am afraid you will be sometimes solitary, but endeavour, whether alone or in company, to keep yourself cheerful. My friends likewise die very fast, but such is the state of man. I am, dear love, your most humble servant, Samuel Johnson, May the 4th, 1779. He had, before I left London, resumed the conversation concerning the appearance of a ghost at Newcastle upon Tyne, which Mr. John Wesley believed, but to which Johnson did not give credit. I was, however, desirous to examine the question closely, and at the same time wished to be made acquainted with Mr. John Wesley, for though I differed from him in some points, I admired his various talents, and loved his pious zeal. At my request, therefore, Dr. Johnson gave me a letter of introduction to him. To the Reverend Mr. John Wesley, Sir, Mr. Boswell, a gentleman who has been long known to me, is desirous of being known to you, and has asked this recommendation, which I give him with great willingness, because I think it very much to be wished that worthy and religious men should be acquainted with each other. I am, Sir, your most humble servant, Samuel Johnson, May the 3rd, 1779. Mr. Wesley being in the course of his ministry at Edinburgh, I presented this letter to him, and it was very politely received. I begged to have it returned to me, which was accordingly done. His state of the evidence as to the ghost did not satisfy me. I did not write to Johnson, as usual, upon my return to my family, but tried how he would be affected by my silence. Mr. Dilly sent me a copy of a note which he received from him on the 13th of July, in these words: To Mr. Dilly, Sir, since Mr. Boswell's departure, I have never heard from him. Please to send word what you know of him, and whether you have sent my books to his lady. I am, etc., Samuel Johnson. My readers will not doubt that his solicitude about me was very flattering. To James Boswell, Esquire, Dear Sir, what can possibly have happened that keeps us two such strangers to each other? I expected to have heard from you when you came home. I expected afterwards. I went into the country and returned, and yet there is no letter from Mr. Boswell. Footnote: Johnson started for Lichfield and Ashbourne about May the 20th, and returned to London towards the end of June. It is good, he wrote, to wander a little, lest one should dream that all the world was Streatham, of which one may venture to say none but itself can be its parallel. None but thyself can be thy parallel is from Theobald's Double Falsehood. Pope calls it a marvellous line, and thus introduces it in the Dunciad. For works like these let deathless journals tell, none but thyself can be thy parallel. End of footnote. No ill, I hope, has happened, and if ill should happen, why should it be concealed from him who loves you? Is it a fit of humour that has disposed you to try who can hold out longest without writing? If it be, you have the victory. But I am afraid of something bad. Set me free from my suspicions. My thoughts are at present employed in guessing the reason of your silence. You must not expect that I should tell you anything, if I had anything to tell. Write, pray write to me, and let me know what is or what has been the cause of this long interruption. I am, dear Sir, your most affectionate humble servant, Samuel Johnson, July the 13th, 1779. To Dr. Samuel Johnson, Edinburgh, July the 17th, 1779. My dear Sir, what may be justly denominated a supine indolence of mind has been my state of existence since I last returned to Scotland. In a livelier state, I had often suffered severely from long intervals of silence on your part, and I had even been chided by you for expressing my uneasiness. I was willing to take advantage of my insensibility, and, while I could bear the experiment, to try whether your affection for me would, after an unusual silence on my part, make you write first. This afternoon I have had very high satisfaction by receiving your kind letter of inquiry, for which I most gratefully thank you. I am doubtful if it was right to make the experiment. though I have gained by it. I was beginning to grow tender and to upbraid myself, especially after having dreamt 2 nights ago that I was with you. I and my wife and my 4 children are all well. I would not delay 1 post to answer your letter, but as it is late, I have not time to do more. You shall soon hear from me upon many and various particulars, and I shall never again put you to any test. I am, with veneration, my dear sir, your much obliged and faithful humble servant, James Boswell. On the 22nd of July I wrote to him again, and gave him an account of my last interview with my worthy friend Mr. Edward Dilly at his brother's house at South Hill in Bedfordshire, where he died soon after I parted from him, leaving me a very kind remembrance of his regard. Footnote: Boswell, on his way to Scotland, wrote to Temple from this house, I am now at South Hill, to which place Mr. Charles Dilly has accompanied. It is the house of Squire John Dilly, his elder brother. The family of Dilly have been land proprietors in this county for 200 years. I am quite the great man here, and am to go forward on the North Road to-morrow morning. Poor Mr. Edward Dilly is fast a-dying. He cried with affection at seeing me here. He is in as agreeable a frame as any Christian can be. I am edified here. End of footnote. I informed him that Lord Hailes, who had promised to furnish him with some anecdotes for his Lives of the Poets, had sent me 3 instances of Prior's borrowing from Gombold in Recueil des Poètes, tome 3. Epigram to John, I owed great obligation, page 25. To the Duke of Noailles, page 32. Sauntering Jack and Idle Joan, page 25. My letter was a pretty long one, and contained a variety of particulars, but he, it should seem, had not attended to it, for his next to me was as follows. To James Boswell, Esquire, my dear Sir, are you playing the same trick again, and trying who can keep silence longest? Remember that all tricks are either knavish or childish, and that it is as foolish to make experiments upon the constancy of a friend as upon the chastity of a wife. What can be the cause of this second fit of silence I cannot conjecture, but after one trick I will not be cheated by another, nor will harass my thoughts with conjectures about the motives of a man who probably acts only by caprice. I therefore suppose you are well, and that Mrs. Boswell is well too, and that the fine summer has restored Lord Affleck. I am much better than you left me. I think I am better than when I was in Scotland. Footnote. On June the 18th in the following year he recorded, In the morning of this day last year I perceived the remission of those convulsions in my breast which had distressed me for more than 20 years. I returned thanks at church for the mercy granted me, which has now continued a year. 3 days later he wrote, It was a 12-month last Sunday since the convulsions in my breast left me. I hope I was thankful when I recollected it. By removing that disorder a great improvement was made in the enjoyment of life. I am now as well as men at my age can expect to be, and I yet think I shall be better. End of footnote. I forgot whether I informed you that poor Thrale has been in great danger. Footnote. from a stroke of apoplexy. Johnson wrote to Mrs. Thrale, "You really do not use me well in thinking that I am in less pain on this occasion than I ought to be. There is nobody left for me to care about but you and my master, and I have now for many years known the value of his friendship and the importance of his life too well not to have him very near my heart." To him he wrote shortly after the attack, no doubt with a view to give the sick man confidence: "To show you how well I think of your health, I have sent you £100 to keep for me." Miss Burney wrote very soon after the attack, "At dinner everybody tried to be cheerful, but a dark and gloomy cloud hangs over the head of poor Mr. Thrale, which no flashes of merriment or beams of wit can pierce through. Yet he seems pleased that everybody should be gay." The attack was in June. On August 3 Johnson wrote to Dr. Taylor, "Mr. Thrale has perfectly recovered all his faculties and all his vigour." Mrs. Thrale likewise has miscarried and been much indisposed. Everybody else is well. Langton is in camp. I intend to put Lord Hales's description of Dryden into another edition, and as I know his accuracy, wish he would consider the dates, which I could not always settle to my own mind. Mr. Thrale goes to Brighthelmston about Michaelmas to be jolly and ride a hunting. I shall go to town, or perhaps to Oxford. Exercise and gaiety, or rather carelessness, will, I hope, dissipate all remains of his malady, and I likewise hope by the change of place to find some opportunities of growing yet better myself. I am, dear Sir, your humble servant, Samuel Johnson, Streatham, September 9, 1779. Footnote: he recorded of his birthday this year: "On the 17th, Mr. Shamir took me away with him from Streatham. I left the servants a guinea for my health, and was content enough to escape into a house where my birthday, not being known, could not be mentioned. I sat up till midnight was past, and the day of a new year, a very awful day, began." End of footnote. My readers will not be displeased at being told every slight circumstance of the manner in which Dr. Johnson contrived to amuse his solitary hours. He sometimes employed himself in chemistry, sometimes in watering and pruning a vine, sometimes in small experiments, at which those who may smile should recollect that there are moments which admit of being soothed only by trifles. Footnote: in one of his manuscript diaries there is the following entry, which marks his curious minute attention: "July 26, 1768. I shaved my nail by accident in whetting the knife, about 1/8 of an inch from the bottom, and about 1/4 from the top. This I measure that I may know the growth of nails. The hole is about 5/8 of an inch. Another of the same kind appears. August 7, 1779. Partem brachii dextri capo proximam, et cutem pectoris circa mamillam dextram rasi, ut notem fieret quanta temporis pili renovarentur." And August 15, 1773, "I cut from the vine 41 leaves, which weighed 5 ounces and a half, and 8 scruples. I lay them upon my bookcase to see what weight they will lose by drying. Boswell. In The Idler we have in Mr. Sober a portrait of Johnson drawn by himself. He writes, "The art is to fill the day with petty business, to have always something in hand which may raise curiosity but not solicitude, and keep the mind in a state of action but not of labour. This art has for many years been practised by my old friend Sober, with wonderful success. His chief pleasure is conversation. There is no end of his talk or his attention. To speak or to hear is equally pleasing, for he still fancies that he is teaching or learning something, and is free for the time from his own reproaches. But there is one time at night when he must go home that his friends may sleep, and another time in the morning when all the world agrees to shut out interruption. These are the moments of which poor Sober trembles at the thought. But the misery of these tiresome intervals he has many means of alleviating. His daily amusement is chemistry. He has a small furnace which he employs in distillation, and which has long been the solace of his life. He draws oils and waters, and essences and spirits, which he knows to be of no use, sits and counts the drops as they come from his retort, and forgets that whilst a drop is falling, a moment flies away. Mrs. Piozzi says, "We made up a sort of laboratory at Streatham one summer, and diverted ourselves with drawing essences and colouring liquors. But the danger Mr. Thrale found his friend in one day, when he got the children and servants round him to see some experiments performed, put an end to all our entertainment." End of footnote. On the 20th of September I defended myself against his suspicion of me, which I did not deserve, and added, "Pray let us write frequently. A whim strikes me that we should send off a sheet once a week, like a stage coach, whether it be full or not, nay, though it should be empty. The very sight of your handwriting would comfort me, and were a sheet to be thus sent regularly, we should much oftener convey something, were it only a few kind words." My friend Colonel James Stuart, second son of the Earl of Bute, who had distinguished himself as a good officer of the Bedfordshire militia, had taken a public spirited resolution to serve his country in its difficulties by raising a regular regiment, and taking the command of it himself. Footnote. Horace Walpole, in April 1778, wrote, "It was very remarkable that on the militia being ordered out, 2 of Lord Bute's younger sons offered, as Bedfordshire gentlemen, to take any rank in the militia in that county. I warned Lord Ossory, the Lord Lieutenant, against so dangerous a precedent as admitting Scots in the militia. A militia can only be safe by being officered by men of property in each county." End of footnote. This, in the heir of the immense property of Wortley, was highly honourable. Footnote. Walpole wrote in December 1778, "His Majesty complained of the difficulty of recruiting. General Keppel replied aloud, 'It is owing to the Scots, who raise their clans in and about London.'" This was very true. The Master of Lovat had received a royal gift of £6,000 to raise a regiment of his clan, and had literally picked up boys of 15 in London and Westminster. End of footnote. Having been in Scotland recruiting, he obligingly asked me to accompany him to Leeds, then the headquarters of his corps, from thence to London for a short time, and afterwards to other places to which the regiment might be ordered. Such an offer, at a time of the year when I had full leisure, was very pleasing, especially as I was to accompany a man of sterling good sense, information, discernment, and conviviality, and was to have a second crop in 1 year of London and Johnson. Of this I informed my illustrious friend in characteristical warm terms, in a letter dated the 30th of September from Leeds. On Monday, October the 4th, I called at his house before he was up. He sent for me to his bedside, and expressed his satisfaction at this incidental meeting with as much vivacity as if he had been in the gaiety of youth. He called briskly, "Frank, go and get coffee, and let us breakfast in splendour." During this visit to London I had several interviews with him, which it is unnecessary to distinguish particularly. I consulted him as to the appointment of guardians to my children in the case of my death. "Sir," said he, "do not appoint a number of guardians. When there are many, they trust one to another, and the business is neglected. I would advise you to choose only one. Let him be a man of respectable character, who for his own credit will do what is right. Let him be a rich man, so that he may be under no temptation to take advantage. And let him be a man of business, who is used to conduct affairs with ability and expertness, to whom, therefore, the execution of the trust will not be burdensome." Footnote. He made his will in his wife's lifetime, and appointed her and Sir William Forbes, or the survivor of them, tutors and curators to his children. End of footnote. On Sunday, October the 10th, we dined together at Mr. Strahan's. The conversation having turned on the prevailing practice of going to the East Indies in quest of wealth, Johnson: "A man had better have £10,000 at the end of 10 years passed in England than £20,000 at the end of 10 years passed in India, because you must compute what you give for money. And a man who has lived 10 years in India has given up 10 years of social comfort and all those advantages which arise from living in England." The ingenious Mr. Brown, distinguished by the name of Capability Brown, told me that he was once at the seat of Lord Clive, who had returned from India with great wealth, and that he showed him at the door of his bedchamber a large chest, which he said he had once had full of gold. Footnote. Head gardener at Stowe, and afterwards at Hampton Court and Windsor. He got his nickname from his habit of saying that grounds which he was asked to lay out had capabilities. Lord Chatham wrote of him, "He writes Lancelot Brown, Esquire, on titre d'office. Please to consider, he shares the private hours of the King, dines familiarly with his neighbour of Sion, the Duke of Northumberland, and sits down at the tables of all the House of Lords," etc. End of footnote. Upon which Brown observed, "I am glad you can bear it so near your bedchamber." Footnote. Clive, before the committee of the House of Commons, exclaimed, "By God, Mr. Chairman, at this moment I stand astonished at my own moderation." End of footnote. End of section 42. Section 43 of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 3, by James Boswell, Section 43. We talked of the state of the poor in London. Johnson. Saunders Welsh, the Justice, who was once High Constable of Holborn, and had the best opportunities of knowing the state of the poor, told me that I underrated the number when I computed that 20 a week, that is, above 1,000 a year, died of hunger, not absolutely of immediate hunger, but of the wasting and other diseases which are the consequences of hunger. Footnote. Yet, according to Johnson, the poor in England were better provided for than in any other country of the same extent. End of footnote. This happens only in so large a place as London, where people are not known. What we are told about the great sums got by begging is not true. The trade is overstocked, and you may depend upon it, there are many who cannot get work. A particular kind of manufacture fails. Those who have been used to work at it can for some time work at nothing else. You meet a man begging. You charge him with idleness. He says, "I am willing to labour. Will you give me work?" "I cannot." "Why, then you have no right to charge me with idleness." We left Mr. Strahan's at 7, as Johnson had said he intended to go to evening prayers. As we walked along, he complained of a little gout in his toe, and said, "I shan't go to prayers tonight, I shall go tomorrow." Whenever I miss church on a Sunday, I resolve to go another day, but I do not always do it. This was a fair exhibition of that vibration between pious resolutions and indolence, which many of us have too often experienced. I went home with him, and we had a long, quiet conversation. I read him a letter from Dr. Hugh Blair concerning Pope, in writing whose life he was now employed, which I shall insert as a literary curiosity. Footnote. The Reverend Dr. Law, Bishop of Carlisle, in the preface to his valuable edition of Archbishop King's Essay on the Origin of Evil, mentions that the principles maintained in it had been adopted by Pope in his Essay on Man, and adds, "The fact, notwithstanding such denial, Bishop Warburton's, might have been strictly verified by an unexceptionable testimony, namely, that of the late Lord Bathurst, who saw the very same system of the Tobeltean taken from the Archbishop in Lord Bolingbroke's own hand, lying before Mr. Pope while he was composing his essay. This is respectable evidence, but that of Dr. Blair is more direct from the fountainhead, as well as more full. Let me add to it that of Dr. Joseph Warton. The late Lord Bathurst repeatedly assured me that he had read the whole scheme of the Essay on Man in the handwriting of Bolingbroke, and drawn up in a series of propositions which Pope was to versify and illustrate. Boswell. In the above short quotation from Law are 2 parentheses. According to Paley, the Bishop was once impatient at the slowness of his Carlisle printer. "Why does not my book make its appearance?" he said to the printer. "My Lord, I am extremely sorry, but we have been obliged to send to Glasgow for a pound of parentheses." End of footnote. To James Boswell, Esquire. Dear Sir, in the year 1763, being at London, I was carried by Dr. John Blair, Prebendary of Westminster, to dine at old Lord Bathurst's, where we found the late Mr. Mallet, Sir James Porter, who had been ambassador at Constantinople, the late Dr. Macaulay, and 2 or 3 more. The conversation turning on Mr. Pope, Lord Bathurst told us that the essay on man was originally composed by Lord Bolingbroke in prose, and that Mr. Pope did no more than put it into verse; that he had read Lord Bolingbroke's manuscript in his own handwriting, and remembered well that he was at a loss whether most to admire the elegance of Lord Bolingbroke's prose, or the beauty of Mr. Pope's verse. When Lord Bathurst told this, Mr. Mallet bade me attend and remember this remarkable piece of information, as, by the course of nature, I might survive his lordship, and be a witness of his having said so. The conversation was indeed too remarkable to be forgotten. A few days after, meeting with you, who were then also in London, you will remember that I mentioned to you what had passed on this subject, as I was much struck with this anecdote. But what ascertains my recollection of it beyond doubt is that, being accustomed to keep a journal of what passed when I was in London, which I wrote out every evening, I find the particulars of the above information, just as I have now given them, distinctly marked, and am thence enabled to fix this conversation to have passed on Friday, the 22nd of April, 1763. I remember also distinctly, though I have not for this the authority of my journal, that the conversation going on concerning Mr. Pope, I took notice of a report which had been sometimes propagated, that he did not understand Greek. Footnote: to those who censured his politics were added enemies yet more dangerous, who called in question his knowledge of Greek, and his qualifications for a translator of Homer. To these he made no public opposition, but in one of his letters escapes from them as well as he can. At an age like his, for he was not more than 25, with an irregular education, and a course of life of which much seems to have passed in conversation, it is not very likely that he overflowed with Greek. But when he felt himself deficient, he sought assistance. And what man of learning would refuse to help him? Johnson refers, I think, to Pope's letter to Addison of January 30th, 1713-14. End of footnote. Lord Bathurst said to me that he knew that to be false, for that part of the Iliad was translated by Mr. Pope in his house in the country, and that in the mornings, when they assembled at breakfast, Mr. Pope used frequently to repeat with great rapture the Greek lines which he had been translating, and then to give them his version of them, and to compare them together. If these circumstances can be of any use to Dr. Johnson, you have my full liberty to give them to him. I beg you will at the same time present to him my most respectful compliments, with best wishes for his success and fame in all his literary undertakings. I am, with great respect, my dearest Sir, your most affectionate and obliged humble servant, Hugh Blair, Broughton Park, September the 21st, 1779. Johnson. Depend upon it, sir, this is too strongly stated. Pope may have had from Bolingbroke the philosophic stamina of his essay, and admitting this to be true, Lord Bathurst did not intentionally falsify, but the thing is not true in the latitude that Blair seems to imagine. We are sure that the poetical imagery, which makes a great part of the poem, was Pope's own. Footnote. that those communications had been consolidated into a scheme regularly drawn and delivered to Pope, from whom it returned only transformed from prose to verse, has been reported, but can hardly be true. The essay plainly appears the fabric of a poet. What Bolingbroke supplied could be only the first principles. The order, illustration, and embellishments must all be Pope's. Dr. Warton says that he had repeatedly heard from Lord Bathurst the statement recorded by Dr. Blair. End of footnote. It is amazing, sir, what deviations there are from precise truth in the account which is given of almost everything. Footnote. In defiance of censure and contempt, truth is frequently violated, and scarcely the most vigilant and unremitted circumspection will secure him that mixes with mankind from being hourly deceived by men of whom it can scarcely be imagined that they mean any injury to him or profit to themselves. End of footnote. I told Mrs. Thrale, "You have so little anxiety about truth, that you never tax your memory with the exact thing." Now what is the use of memory to truth, if one is careless of exactness? Lord Hales's Annals of Scotland are very exact, but they contain mere dry particulars. They are to be considered as a dictionary. You know such things are there, and may be looked at when you please. Robertson paints, but the misfortune is, you are sure he does not know the people whom he paints, so you cannot suppose a likeness. Characters should never be given by an historian unless he knew the people whom he describes, or copies from those who knew them. Boswell. Why, sir, do people play this trick, which I observe now when I look at your grate, putting the shovel against it to make the fire burn? Johnson. They play the trick, but it does not make the fire burn. There is a better, setting the poker perpendicularly up at right angles with the grate. In days of superstition they thought, as it made a cross with the bars, it would drive away the witch. Boswell. By associating with you, sir, I am always getting an accession of wisdom. But perhaps a man, after knowing his own character, the limited strength of his own mind, should not be desirous of having too much wisdom, considering quid valeant humeri, how little he can carry. Footnote. Versate diu quid ferere cusent quid valeant humeri. Weigh with care what suits your genius, what your strength can bear. Boswell seems to be afraid of having his head made to ache again by the sense that Johnson should put into it. End of footnote. Johnson. Sir, be as wise as you can. Let a man be aliis laetus sapiens sibi. Though pleased to see the dolphins play, I mind my compass and my way. You may be wise in your study in the morning, and gay in company at a tavern in the evening. Every man is to take care of his own wisdom and his own virtue, without minding too much what others think. He said, Dodsley first mentioned to me the scheme of an English dictionary, but I had long thought of it. Boswell. You did not know what you were undertaking? Johnson. Yes, sir, I knew very well what I was undertaking, and very well how to do it, and have done it very well. Footnote. Of Dryden he wrote, he began even now to exercise the domination of conscious genius by recommending his own performance. End of footnote. Boswell. An excellent climax, and it has availed you. In your preface you say, "What would it avail me in this gloom of solitude?" You have been agreeably mistaken. In his Life of Milton he observes, "I cannot but remark a kind of respect, perhaps unconsciously, paid to this great man by his biographers. Every house in which he resided is historically mentioned, as if it were an injury to neglect naming any place that he honoured by his presence." I had, before I read this observation, been desirous of showing that respect to Johnson by various inquiries. Finding him this evening in a very good humour, I prevailed on him to give me an exact list of his places of residence since he entered the metropolis as an author, which I subjoin in a note. I mentioned to him a dispute between a friend of mine and his lady concerning conjugal infidelity, which my friend had maintained was by no means so bad in the husband as in the wife. Johnson. Your friend was in the right, sir. Between a man and his Maker it is a different question, but between a man and his wife a husband's infidelity is nothing. They are connected by children, by fortune, by serious considerations of community. Wise married women don't trouble themselves about the infidelity in their husbands. Boswell. To be sure, there is a great difference between the offence of infidelity in a man and that of his wife. Johnson. The difference is boundless. The man imposes no bastards upon his wife. Here it may be questioned whether Johnson was entirely in the right. I suppose it will not be controverted that the difference in the degree of criminality is very great on account of consequences, but still it may be maintained that, independent of moral obligation, infidelity is by no means a light offence in a husband, because it must hurt a delicate attachment in which a mutual constancy is implied, with such refined sentiments as Massinger has exhibited in his play of The Picture. Johnson probably at another time would have admitted this opinion. And let it be kept in remembrance that he was very careful not to give any encouragement to irregular conduct. A gentleman, not adverting to the distinction made by him upon this subject, supposed a case of singular perverseness in a wife, and heedlessly said that then he thought a husband might do as he pleased with a safe conscience. Footnote. If, as seems to be meant, the gentleman supposed the case on this occasion, he must have been Boswell, for no one else was present with Johnson. End of footnote. Johnson. Nay, sir, this is wild indeed, smiling. You must consider that fornication is a crime in a single man, and you cannot have more liberty by being married. He this evening expressed himself strongly against the Roman Catholics, observing, "In everything in which they differ from us, they are wrong." He was even against the invocation of saints. In short, he was in the humour of opposition. Having regretted to him that I had learnt little Greek, as is too generally the case in Scotland, that I had for a long time hardly applied at all to the study of that noble language, and that I was desirous of being told by him what method to follow, he recommended to me as easy helps Sylvanus's first book of the Iliad, Dawson's Lexicon to the Greek New Testament, and Hesiod, with Pesori's Lexicon at the end of it. On Tuesday, October the 13th, I dined with him at Mr. Ramsay's with Lord Newhaven. Footnote. Lord Newhaven was one of a creation of 18 Irish peers in 1776. It was a mob of nobility, wrote Horace Walpole. The king in private laughed much at the eagerness for such insignificant honours. End of footnote. And some other company, none of whom I recollect but a beautiful Miss Graham, a relation of his lordship's, who asked Dr. Johnson to hob or nob with her. He was flattered by such pleasing attention, and politely told her he never drank wine, but if she would drink a glass of water, he was much at her service. She accepted. "Oh, sir," said Lord Newhaven, "you are caught." Johnson. "Nay, I do not see how I am caught, but if I am caught, I don't want to get free again. If I am caught, I hope to be kept." Then, when the 2 glasses of water were brought, smiling placidly to the young lady, he said, "Madam, let us reciprocate." Lord Newhaven and Johnson carried on an argument for some time concerning the Middlesex election. Johnson said, "Parliament may be considered as bound by law as a man is bound when there is nobody to tie the knot. As it is clear that the House of Commons may expel, and expel again and again, why not allow of the power to incapacitate for that Parliament, rather than have a perpetual contest kept up between Parliament and the people?" Lord Newhaven took the opposite side, but respectfully said, "I speak with great deference to you, Dr. Johnson. I speak to be instructed." This had its full effect on my friend. He bowed his head almost as low as the table to a complimenting nobleman, and called out, my lord, I do not desire all this ceremony. Let us tell our minds to one another quietly." After the debate was over, he said, "I have got lights on the subject to-day which I had not before." This was a great deal from him, especially as he had written a pamphlet upon it. He observed, "The House of Commons was originally not a privilege of the people, but a check for the Crown on the House of Lords. I remember Henry VIII. Wanted them to do something. They hesitated in the morning, but did it in the afternoon. He told them, 'It is well you did, or half your heads should have been upon Temple Bar.'" Footnote. Henry VIII. Once threatened to cut off the head of Edward Montague, one of the members, not the Speaker, as Mr. Croker says, if he did not get a money bill passed by the next day. The bill, according to the story, was passed. Mr. P. Cunningham informed Mr. Croker that Johnson was here guilty of an anachronism, for that heads were first placed on Temple Bar in William III's time. End of footnote. But the House of Commons is no longer under the power of the Crown, and therefore must be bribed. He added, "I have no delight in talking of public affairs." Footnote. Horace Walpole thus describes public affairs in February of this year: "The Navy disgusted, insurrections in Scotland, Wales mutinous, a rebellion ready to break out in Ireland, where 15,000 Protestants were in arms, without authority for their own defence, many of them well-wishers to the Americans, and all so ruined, they insisted on relief from Parliament, or were ready to throw off subjection. Holland pressed by France to refuse us assistance, and demanding whether we would or not protect them. Uncertainty of the fate of the West Indian Islands, and dread, at least, that Spain might take part with France. Lord North at the same time perplexed to raise money on the loan, but at 8%, which was demanded. Such a position and such a prospect might have shaken the stoutest king and the ablest administration, Yet the king was insensible to his danger. He had attained what pleased him most, his own will at home. His ministers were nothing but his tools. Everybody called them so, and they proclaimed it themselves. In this melancholy enumeration he passes over the American War. End of footnote. Of his fellow collegian, the celebrated Mr. George Whitfield, he said, "Whitfield never drew as much attention as a mountebank does. He did not draw attention by doing better than others, but by doing what was strange." Footnote. Wesley himself recorded in 1739, "I have been all my life, till very lately, so tenacious of every point relating to decency and order, that I should have thought the saving of souls almost a sin, if it had not been done in a church." End of footnote. Were Astley to preach a sermon standing upon his head on a horse's back, he would collect a multitude to hear him. But no wise man would say he had made a better sermon for that. Footnote. Horace Walpole talks of someone riding on 3 elephants at once, like Astley. Later he says, "I can almost believe that I could dance a minuet on a horse galloping full speed, like young Astley." End of footnote. I never treated Whitfield's ministry with contempt. I believe he did good. He had devoted himself to the lower classes of mankind, and among them he was of use. But when familiarity and noise claim the praise due to knowledge, art, and elegance, we must beat down such pretensions. Boswell. What I have preserved of his conversation during the remainder of my stay in London at this time is only what follows. I told him that when I objected to keeping company with a notorious infidel, a celebrated friend of ours said to me, footnote, Mr. Croker says that the celebrated friend was no doubt Burke. Burke, however, is generally described by Boswell as eminent. Moreover, Burke was not in the habit of getting drunk, as seems to have been the case with the celebrated friend. Boswell calls Hamilton celebrated, but then Boswell and Hamilton were not friends. End of footnote. I do not think that men who live laxly in the world, as you and I do, can with propriety assume such an authority. Dr. Johnson may, who is uniformly exemplary in his conduct, but it is not very consistent to shun an infidel today and get drunk tomorrow. Johnson. Nay, sir, this is sad reasoning. Because a man cannot be right in all things, is he to be right in nothing? Because a man sometimes gets drunk, is he therefore to steal? This doctrine would very soon bring a man to the gallows. After all, however, it is a difficult question how far sincere Christians should associate with the avowed enemies of religion. For in the first place, almost every man's mind may be more or less corrupted by evil communications. Secondly, the world may very naturally suppose that they are not really in earnest in religion, who can easily bear its opponents. And thirdly, if the profane find themselves quite well received by the pious, one of the checks upon an open declaration of their infidelity, and one of the probable chances of obliging them seriously to reflect, which their being shunned would do, is removed. He, I know not why, showed upon all occasions an aversion to go to Ireland, where I proposed to him that we should make a tour. Johnson. It is the last place where I should wish to travel. Boswell. Should you not like to see Dublin, sir? Johnson. No, sir. Dublin is only a worse capital. Boswell. Is not the Giant's Causeway worth seeing? Johnson. Worth seeing, yes, but not worth going to see. Yet he had a kindness for the Irish nation, and thus generously expressed himself to a gentleman from that country on the subject of an union, which artful politicians have often had in view. Do not make an union with us, sir. We should unite with you only to rob you. We should have robbed the Scotch, if they had had anything of which we could have robbed them. Of an acquaintance of ours, his manners and everything about him, though expensive, were coarse, he said, "So you see in him vulgar prosperity." A foreign minister of no very high talents, who had been in his company for a considerable time quite overlooked, happened luckily to mention that he had read some of his Rambler in Italian, and admired it much. This pleased him greatly. He observed that the title had been translated Il Genio Errante, though I have been told it was rendered more ludicrously Il Vagabondo. Footnote: Prince Gonzaga di Castiglione, when dining in company with Dr. Johnson, thinking it was a polite as well as gay thing to drink the doctor's health with some proof that he had read his works, called out from the top of the table to the bottom, "At your health, Mr. Vagabond." Madame D'Arblay says, "General Paoli diverted us all very much by begging leave of Mrs. Thrale to give one toast, and then with smiling pomposity pronouncing, 'The great Vagabond.'" End of footnote. And finding that this minister gave such a proof of his taste, he was all attention to him, and on the first remark which he made, however simple, exclaimed, "The ambassador says well, his Excellency observes," and then he expanded and enriched the little that had been said in so strong a manner that it appeared something of consequence. Footnote: Very near to admiration is the wish to admire. Every man willingly gives value to the praise which he receives, and considers the sentence passed in his favour as the sentence of discernment. End of footnote. End of section 43. Section 44 of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 3, by James Boswell, Section 44. This was exceedingly entertaining to the company who were present, and many a time afterwards it furnished a pleasant topic of merriment. "The ambassador says well" became a laughable term of applause when no mighty matter had been expressed. I left London on Monday, October the 18th, and accompanied Colonel Stuart to Chester, where his regiment was to lie for some time. Mr. Boswell to Dr. Johnson. Chester, October the 22nd, 1779. My dear Sir, it was not till 1 o'clock on Monday morning that Colonel Stuart and I left London, for we chose to bid a cordial adieu to Lord Mountstuart, who was to set out on that day on his embassy to Turin. We drove on excellently, and reached Lichfield in good time enough that night. The Colonel had heard so preferable a character of the George, that he would not put up at the 3 Crowns, so that I did not see our host Wilkins. We found at the George as good accommodation as we could wish to have, and I fully enjoyed the comfortable thought that I was in Lichfield again. Next morning it rained very hard, and as I had much to do in a little time, I ordered a post chaise, and between 8 and 9 sallied forth to make a round of visits. I first went to Mr. Green, hoping to have had him to accompany me to all my other friends, but he was engaged to attend the Bishop of Sodor and Man, who was then lying at Lichfield very ill of the gout. Having taken a hasty glance at the additions to Green's museum, from which it was not easy to break away, I next went to the Friary, where I at first occasioned some tumult in the ladies, who were not prepared to receive company so early. But my name, which has by wonderful felicity come to be closely associated with yours, soon made all easy, and Mrs. Cobb and Miss Adye reassumed their seats at the breakfast table, which they had quitted with some precipitation. They received me with the kindness of an old acquaintance, and after we had joined in a cordial chorus to your praise, Mrs. Cobb gave me the high satisfaction of hearing that you said, "Boswell is a man who, I believe, never left a house without leaving a wish for his return." And she afterwards added, that she bid you tell me that if ever I came to Lichfield, she hoped I would take a bed at the Friary. From thence I drove to Peter Garrick's, where I also found a very flattering welcome. He appeared to me to enjoy his usual cheerfulness, and he very kindly asked me to come when I could and pass a week with him. From Mr. Garrick's I went to the palace to wait on Mr. Seward. I was first entertained by his lady and daughter, he himself being in bed with a cold, according to his valetudinary custom. But he desired to see me, and I found him dressed in his black gown with a white flannel nightgown above it, so that he looked like a Dominican friar. He was good-humoured and polite, and under his roof too my reception was very pleasing. I then proceeded to Stow Hill, and first paid my respects to Mrs. Gastrell, whose conversation I was not willing to quit, but my sand-glass was now beginning to run low, as I could not trespass too long on the Colonel's kindness, who obligingly waited for me, so I hastened to Mrs. Aston's, whom I found much better than I feared I should, and there I met a brother-in-law of these ladies, who talked much of you, and very well too, as it appeared to me. It then only remained to visit Mrs. Lucy Porter, which I did, I really believe, with sincere satisfaction on both sides. I am sure I was glad to see her again, and as I take her to be very honest, I trust she was glad to see me again, for she expressed herself so that I could not doubt of her being in earnest. What a great keystone of kindness, my dear sir, were you that morning, for we were all held together by our common attachment to you. I cannot say that I ever passed 2 hours with more self-complacency than I did those 2 at Lichfield. Let me not entertain any suspicion that this is idle vanity. Will you not confirm me in my persuasion that he who finds himself so regarded has just reason to be happy? We got to Chester about midnight on Tuesday, and here again I am in a state of much enjoyment. Colonel Stuart and his officers treat me with all the civility I could wish, and I play my part admirably. Laetus aliis sapiens sibi, the classical sentence which you, I imagine, invented the other day, is exemplified in my present existence. The bishop, to whom I had the honour to be known several years ago, shows me much attention, and I am edified by his conversation. I must not omit to tell you that his lordship admires very highly your prefaces to the poets. I am daily obtaining an extension of agreeable acquaintance, so that I am kept in animated variety, and the study of the place itself, by the assistance of books and of the bishop, is sufficient occupation. Chester pleases my fancy more than any town I ever saw, but I will not enter upon it at all in this letter. How long I shall stay here I cannot yet say. I told a very pleasing young lady, Miss Letitia Barnston, niece to one of the prebendaries, at whose house I saw her, I have come to Chester, madam, I cannot tell how, and far less can I tell how I am to get away from it. Do not think me too juvenile. I beg it of you, my dear sir, to favour me with a letter while I am here, and add to the happiness of a happy friend, who is ever, with affectionate veneration, most sincerely yours, James Boswell. If you do not write directly so as to catch me here, I shall be disappointed. 2 lines from you will keep my lamp burning bright. Footnote: At Chester I passed a fortnight in mortal felicity. I had from my earliest years a love for the military life, and there is in it an animation and relish of existence which I have never found among any other set of men except players, with whom, you know, I once lived a great deal. At the mess of Colonel Stuart's regiment I was quite the great man, as we used to say, and I was at the same time all joyous and gay. I never found myself so well received anywhere. The young ladies there were delightful, and many of them with capital fortunes. Had I been a bachelor, I should certainly have paid my addresses to a Chester lady. End of footnote. To James Boswell, Esquire. Dear Sir, why should you importune me so earnestly to write? Of what importance can it be to hear of distant friends, to a man who finds himself welcome wherever he goes, and makes new friends faster than he can want them? If to the delight of such universal kindness of reception anything can be added by knowing that you retain my goodwill, you may indulge yourself in the full enjoyment of that small addition. I am glad you made the round of Lichfield with so much success. The oftener you are seen, the more you will be liked. It was pleasing to me to read that Mrs. Aston was so well, and that Lucy Porter was so glad to see you. In the place where you now are, there is much to be observed, and you will easily procure yourself skilful directors. But what will you do to keep away the black dog that worries you at home? Footnote: Mrs. Thrale wrote to Johnson from Brighton in 1778, I have lost what made my happiness in all seasons of the year, but the black dog shall not make prey of both my master and myself. My master swims now, and forgets the black dog. Johnson replied, I shall easily forgive my master his long stay, if he leaves the dog behind him. We will watch as well as we can that the dog shall never be let in again, for when he comes, the first thing he does is to worry my master. End of footnote. If you would, in compliance with your father's advice, inquire into the old tenures and old charters of Scotland, you would certainly open to yourself many striking scenes of the manners of the Middle Ages. The feudal system, in a country half barbarous, is naturally productive of great anomalies in civil life. The knowledge of past times is naturally growing less in all cases not of public record, and the past time of Scotland is so unlike the present, that it is already difficult for a Scotchman to image the economy of his grandfather. Do not be tardy or negligent, but gather up eagerly what can yet be found. Footnote: I have a valuable collection made by my father, which, with some additions and illustrations of my own, I intend to publish. I have some hereditary claim to be an antiquary, not only from my father, but as being descended by the mother's side from the able and learned Sir John Skene, whose merit bids defiance to all the attempts which have been made to lessen his fame. Boswell. End of footnote. We have, I think, once talked of another project, a history of the late insurrection in Scotland, with all its incidents. Many falsehoods are passing into uncontradicted history. Voltaire, who loved a striking story, has told what he could not find to be true. You may make collections for either of these projects, or for both, as opportunities occur, and digest your materials at leisure. The great direction which Burton has left to men disordered like you is this: be not solitary, be not idle, which I would thus modify: if you are idle, be not solitary; if you are solitary, be not idle. Footnote. Burton, in the last lines of The Anatomy of Melancholy, says, "Only take this for a corollary and conclusion: as thou tenderest thine own welfare in this and in all other melancholy, thy good health of body and mind, observe this short precept: give not way to solitariness and idleness. Be not solitary, be not idle." End of footnote. There is a letter for you, from your humble servant, Samuel Johnson. London, October the 22nd, 1779. Footnote. Johnson was in better spirits than usual. The following day he wrote, "I fancy that I grow light and airy. A man that does not begin to grow light and airy at 70 is certainly losing time if he intends ever to be light and airy." End of footnote. To Dr. Samuel Johnson, Carlisle, November the 7th, 1779. My dear Sir, that I should importune you to write to me at Chester is not wonderful, when you consider what an avidity I have for delight, and that the amor of pleasure, like the amor nummi, increases in proportion with the quantity which we possess of it. Your letter, so full of polite kindness and masterly counsel, came like a large treasure upon me, while already glittering with riches. I was quite enchanted at Chester, so that I could with difficulty quit it. But the enchantment was the reverse of that of Circe, for so far was there from being anything sensual in it, that I was all mind. I do not mean all reason only, for my fancy was kept finely in play. And why not? If you please, I will send you a copy or an abridgment of my Chester Journal, which is truly a log book of felicity. The Bishop treated me with a kindness which was very flattering. I told him that you regretted you had seen so little of Chester. His Lordship bade me tell you that he should be glad to show you more of it. I am proud to find the friendship with which you honour me is known in so many places. I arrived here late last night. Our friend the Dean has been gone from hence some months, but I am told at my inn that he is very popular. However, I found Mr. Law, the Archdeacon, son to the Bishop, and with him I have breakfasted and dined very agreeably. I got acquainted with him at the assizes here, about a year and a half ago. He is a man of great variety of knowledge, uncommon genius, and, I believe, sincere religion. I received the Holy Sacrament in the cathedral in the morning, this being the first Sunday in the month, and was at prayers there in the evening. It is divinely cheering to me to think that there is a cathedral so near Affleck, and I now leave old England in such a state of mind as I am thankful to God for granting me. The black dog that worries me at home I cannot but dread, yet as I have been for some time past in a military train, I trust I shall repulse him. To hear from you will animate me like the sound of a trumpet. I therefore hope that soon after my return to the northern field I shall receive a few lines from you. Colonel Stuart did me the honour to escort me in his carriage to show me Liverpool, and from thence back again to Warrington, where we parted. Footnote: his regiment was afterwards ordered to Jamaica, where he accompanied it, and almost lost his life by the climate. This impartial order I should think a sufficient refutation of the idle rumour that there was still something behind the throne greater than the throne itself. Boswell. Lord Shelburne, about the year 1803, likening the growth of the power of the crown to a strong building that had been raised up, said, the Earl of Bute had contrived such a lock to it as a succession of the ablest men have not been able to pick, nor has he ever let the key be so much as seen by which he has held it. End of footnote. In justice to my valuable wife, I must inform you she wrote to me that, as I was so happy, she would not be so selfish as to wish me to return sooner than business absolutely required my presence. She made my clerk write to me a post or two after to the same purpose, by commission from her, and this day a kind letter from her met me at the post office here, acquainting me that she and the little ones were well, and expressing all their wishes for my return home. I am more and more, my dear sir, your affectionate and obliged humble servant, James Boswell. To James Boswell, Esquire. Dear Sir, your last letter was not only kind but fond, but I wish you to get rid of all intellectual excesses, and neither to exalt your pleasures nor aggravate your vexations beyond their real and natural state. Footnote: Boswell on January the 4th wrote to Temple, "How inconsiderable are both you and I in comparison with what we used to hope we should be! Yet your learning and your memoirs set you far above the common run of educated men, and sum pittore anch'io. I too, in several respects, have attained to superiority. But we both want solidity and force of mind, such as we observe in those who rise in active life." End of footnote. Why should you not be as happy at Edinburgh as at Chester? In culpa est animus, qui se non effugit usquam. Footnote: for in the mind alone our follies lie, the mind that never from itself can fly. Francis. End of footnote. Please yourself with your wife and children, and studies and practice. I have sent a petition from Lucy Porter, with which I leave it to your discretion whether it is proper to comply. Footnote: requesting me to inquire concerning the family of a gentleman who was then paying his addresses to Miss Doxey. Boswell. End of footnote. Return me her letter, which I have sent, that you may know the whole case, and not be seduced to anything that you may afterwards repent. Miss Doxey perhaps you know to be Mr. Garrick's niece. If Dean Percy can be popular at Carlisle, he may be very happy. He has in his disposal 2 livings, each equal or almost equal in value to the deanery. He may take one himself and give the other to his son. How near is the cathedral to Affleck that you are so much delighted with it? It is, I suppose, at least 150 miles off. Footnote. It is little more than half that distance. End of footnote. However, if you are pleased, it is so far well. Let me know what reception you have from your father, and the state of his health. Please him as much as you can, and add no pain to his last years. Of our friends here, I can recollect nothing to tell you. I have neither seen nor heard of Langton. Beauclerk is just returned from Brighthelmston, I am told, much better. Mr. Thrale and his family are still there, and his health is said to be visibly improved. He has not bathed, but hunted. Footnote. Johnson wrote to Mrs. Thrale on November the 7th, "My master, I hope, hunts and walks, and courts the bells, and shakes Brighthelmston. When he comes back frolic and active, we will make a feast, and drink his health, and have a noble day." End of footnote. At Bolt Court there is much malignity, but of late little open hostility. Footnote. On November the 16th he wrote, "At home we do not much quarrel, but perhaps the less we quarrel, the more we hate. There is as much malignity amongst us as can well subsist without any thought of daggers or poisons." End of footnote. I have had a cold, but it is gone. Make my compliments to Mrs. Boswell, etc. I am, Sir, your humble servant. London, November the 13th, 1779, Samuel Johnson. On November the 22nd and December the 21st, I wrote to him from Edinburgh, giving a very favourable report of the family of Miss Doxy's lover. That after a good deal of inquiry I had discovered the sister of Mr. Francis Stewart, one of his amanuenses when writing his dictionary, that I had, as desired by him, paid her a guinea for an old pocket book of her brother's which he had retained, and that the good woman, who was in very moderate circumstances, but contented and placid, wondered at his scrupulous and liberal honesty, and received the guinea as if sent her by Providence. That I had repeatedly begged of him to keep his promise to send me his letter to Lord Chesterfield, and that this memento, like delenda est Carthago, must be in every letter that I should write to him till I had obtained my object. 1780, ITART 71. In 1780 the world was kept in impatience for the completion of his Lives of the Poets, upon which he was employed, so far as his indolence allowed him to labour. Footnote. He wrote to Mrs. Thrale on April the 11th, "You are at all places of high resort, and bring home hearts by the dozens, while I am seeking for something to say about men of whom I know nothing but their verses, and sometimes very little of them. Now I have begun, however, I do not despair of making an end." End of footnote. I wrote to him on January the 1st and March the 13th, sending him my notes of Lord Marchmont's information concerning Pope, complaining that I had not heard from him for almost 4 months, though he was 2 letters in my debt, that I had suffered again from melancholy, hoping that he had been in so much better company, the poets, that he had not time to think of his distant friends, for if that were the case, I should have some recompense for my uneasiness, that the state of my affairs did not admit of my coming to London this year, and begging he would return me Goldsmith's 2 poems with his lines marked. His friend Dr. Lawrence, having now suffered the greatest affliction to which a man is liable, and which Johnson himself had felt in the most severe manner, Johnson wrote to him in an admirable strain of sympathy and pious consolation. To Dr. Lawrence, dear Sir, at a time when all your friends ought to show their kindness, and with a character which ought to make all that know you your friends, you may wonder that you have yet heard nothing from me. I have been hindered by a vexatious and incessant cough, for which within these 10 days I have been bled once, fasted 4 or 5 times, taken physic 5 times, and opiates, I think, 6. This day it seems to remit. The loss, dear Sir, which you have lately suffered, I felt many years ago, and know therefore how much has been taken from you, and how little help can be had from consolation. He that outlives a wife whom he has long loved sees himself disjoined from the only mind that has the same hopes and fears and interest, from the only companion with whom he has shared much good or evil, and with whom he could set his mind at liberty to retrace the past or anticipate the future. The continuity of being is lacerated. The settled course of sentiment and action is stopped, and life stands suspended and motionless till it is driven by external causes into a new channel. But the time of suspense is dreadful. Footnote. A writer in Notes and Queries points out that Johnson, writing to a doctor, uses a doctor's language. Until very lately, solution of continuity was a favourite phrase with English surgeons. Where a bone was broken, or the flesh, etc., cut or lacerated, there was a solution of continuity. End of footnote. Our first recourse in this distressed solitude is, perhaps for want of habitual piety, to a gloomy acquiescence in necessity. Of 2 mortal beings, one must lose the other, but surely there is a higher and better comfort to be drawn from the consideration of that providence which watches over all, and a belief that the living and the dead are equally in the hands of God, who will reunite those whom he has separated, or who sees that it is best not to reunite. I am, dear Sir, your most affectionate and most humble servant, Samuel Johnson, January the 20th, 1780. To James Boswell, Esquire. Dear Sir, well, I had resolved to send you the Chesterfield letter, but I will write once again without it. Never impose tasks upon mortals. To require 2 things is the way to have them both undone. For all the difficulties which you mention in your affairs, I am sorry, but difficulty is now very general. It is not, therefore, less grievous, for there is less hope of help. I pretend not to give you advice, not knowing the state of your affairs, and general counsels about prudence and frugality would do little good. You are, however, in the right not to increase your own perplexity by a journey hither, and I hope that by staying at home you will please your father. Poor dear Beauclerk, footnote, he died March the 11th, 1780, aged 40, end of footnote. Nec ut soles dabis ioca, footnote. Animula vagula blandula hospes comesque corporis, quae nunca bibis in loca pallidula rigida nudula, nec ut soles dabis ioca. Adriani Marientis ad animam suam. Poor little pretty fluttering thing, must we no longer live together? And dost thou prune thy trembling wing to take thy flight, thou know'st not whither? Thy humorous vein, thy pleasing folly, lies all neglected, all forgot, and pensive, wavering melancholy, thou dread'st and hopest thou know'st not what. In the Spectator is a letter from Pope to Steele on these famous verses which the Emperor Adrian spoke on his deathbed. End of footnote. His wit and his folly, his acuteness and maliciousness, his merriment and reasoning are now over. Such another will not often be found among mankind. He directed himself to be buried by the side of his mother, an instance of tenderness which I hardly expected. He has left his children to the care of Lady Di, and, if she dies, of Mr. Langton and of Mr. Leicester, his relation, and a man of good character. His library has been offered to sale to the Russian ambassador. Dr. Percy, notwithstanding all the noise in the newspapers, has had no literary loss. Footnote. By a fire in Northumberland House, where he had an apartment, in which I have passed many an agreeable hour. Boswell. End of footnote. Clothes and movables were burnt, to the value of about £100, but his papers, and I think his books, were all preserved. Poor Mr. Thrale has been in extreme danger from an apoplectical disorder, and recovered beyond the expectation of his physicians. He is now at Bath, that his mind may be quiet, and Mrs. Thrale and Miss are with him. Having told you what has happened to your friends, let me say something to you of yourself. You are always complaining of melancholy, and I conclude from those complaints that you are fond of it. No man talks of that which he is desirous to conceal, and every man desires to conceal that of which he is ashamed. Do not pretend to deny it. Manifestum habemus furem. Make it an invariable and obligatory law to yourself never to mention your own mental diseases. If you are never to speak of them, you will think on them but little, and if you think little of them, they will molest you rarely. When you talk of them, it is plain that you want either praise or pity. For praise there is no room, and pity will do you no good. Therefore, from this hour, speak no more, think no more about them. Footnote. In 1768, on his birthday, Johnson recorded, "This day it came into my mind to write the history of my melancholy." End of footnote. Your transaction with Mrs. Stewart gave me great satisfaction. I am much obliged to you for your attention. Do not lose sight of her. Your countenance may be of great credit, and of consequence of great advantage to her. The memory of her brother is yet fresh in my mind. He was an ingenious and worthy man. Please to make my compliments to your lady and to the young ladies. I should like to see them, pretty loves. I am, dear Sir, yours affectionately, Samuel Johnson, April the 8th, 1780. End of section 44. Section 45 of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 3, by James Boswell, Section 45. Mrs. Thrale being now at Bath with her husband, the correspondence between Johnson and her was carried on briskly. I shall present my readers with one of her original letters to him at this time, which will amuse them probably more than those well-written but studied epistles which she has inserted in her collection, because it exhibits the easy vivacity of their literary intercourse. It is also of value as a key to Johnson's answer, which she has printed by itself, and of which I shall subjoin extracts. Mrs. Thrale to Dr. Johnson. I had a very kind letter from you yesterday, dear sir, with a most circumstantial date. Footnote: Johnson had dated his letter London, April 25th, 1780, and added, "Now there is a date, look at it." In his reply he wrote, "London, May the 1st, 1780, mark that. You did not put the year to your last." End of footnote. You took trouble with my circulating letter. Mr. Evans writes me word, and I thank you sincerely for doing so. One might do mischief else, not being on the spot. Yesterday's evening was passed at Mrs. Montagu's. There was Mr. Melmoth, footnote, the author of the Fitzosborne letters. Miss Burney thus describes this evening: "We were appointed to meet the Bishop of Chester at Mrs. Montagu's. This proved a very gloomy kind of grandeur. The Bishop waited for Mrs. Thrale to speak, Mrs. Thrale for the Bishop, so neither of them spoke at all. Mrs. Montagu cared not a fig, as long as she spoke herself, so she harangued away. Meanwhile, Mr. Melmoth, the Pliny Melmoth, as he is called, was of the party, and seemed to think nobody half so great as himself. He seems intolerably self-sufficient, appears to look upon himself as the first man in Bath, and has a proud conceit in look and manner, mighty forbidding." End of footnote. I do not like him, though, nor he me. It was expected we should have pleased each other. He is, however, just Tory enough to hate the Bishop of Peterborough for Whiggism, and Whig enough to abhor you for Toryism. Mrs. Montagu flattered him finely, so we had a good afternoon on't. This evening we spend at a concert. Poor Queenie's sore eyes have just released her. Footnote: a kind of nickname given to Mrs. Thrale's eldest daughter, whose name being Esther, she might be assimilated to a queen. Boswell. End of footnote. She had a long confinement, and could neither read nor write, so my master treated her very good-naturedly with the visits of a young woman in this town, a tailor's daughter, who professes music, and teaches so as to give 6 lessons a day to ladies, at 5 and 3d a lesson. Miss Burney says she is a great performer, and I respect the wench for getting her living so prettily. She is very modest and pretty mannered, and not 17 years old. You live in a fine world indeed. If I did not write regularly, you would half forget me, and that would be very wrong, for I felt my regard for you in my face last night, when the criticisms were going on. This morning it was all connoisseurship. We went to see some pictures painted by a gentleman artist, Mr. Taylor, of this place. My master makes one everywhere, and has got a good Dorling companion to ride with him now. He looks well enough, but I have no notion of health for a man whose mouth cannot be sewed up. Footnote: Miss Burney shows how luxurious a table Mr. Thrale kept. We had, she records, in May 1779, a very grand dinner to-day, though nothing to a Streatham dinner, at the Ship Tavern, Brighton, where the officers mess, to which we were invited by the Major and the Captain. As the Major was a man of at least £8,000 a year, and the Captain of £4,000 or £5,000, the dinner was likely to be grand enough. Yet when Mr. Thrale had his first stroke in 1779, Johnson wrote, "I am the more alarmed by this violent seizure, as I can impute it to no wrong practices, or intemperance of any kind. What can he reform, or what can he add to his regularity and temperance? He can only sleep less." Baretti says, "Dr. Johnson knew that Thrale would eat like four, let physicians preach. Maybe he did not know it, so little did he mind what people were doing. Though he sat by Thrale at dinner, he never noticed whether he ate much or little. A strange man." Yet in a note Baretti had said that Thrale's seizure was caused by the mere grief he could not overcome of his only son's loss. Johnson knew it, but would not tell it. End of footnote. "Burney and I and Queenie tease him every meal he eats, and Mrs. Montague is quite serious with him. But what can one do? He will eat, I think, and if he does eat, I know he will not live. It makes me very unhappy, but I must bear it. Let me always have your friendship. I am most sincerely, dear Sir, your faithful servant, H.L.T. Bath, Friday, April 28th. Dr. Johnson to Mrs. Thrale. Dearest Madam, Mr. Thrale never will live abstinently till he can persuade himself to live by rule. Encourage as you can the musical girl. Nothing is more common than mutual dislike where mutual approbation is particularly expected. There is often on both sides a vigilance not over benevolent, and as attention is strongly excited so that nothing drops unheeded, any difference in taste or opinion, and some difference where there is no restraint, will commonly appear, immediately generates dislike. Never let criticisms operate upon your face or your mind. It is very rarely that an author is hurt by his critics. The blaze of reputation cannot be blown out, but it often dies in the socket. A very few names may be considered as perpetual lamps that shine unconsumed. From the author of Fitzosburn's letters I cannot think myself in much danger. I met him only once, about 30 years ago, and in some small dispute reduced him to whistle. Having not seen him since, this is the last impression. Poor Moore, the fabulist, was one of the company. Footnote: the author of Fables for the Female Sex, and of the Tragedy of the Gamester, and editor of The World. Goldsmith, in his Present State of Polite Learning, after describing the sufferings of authors, continues, "Let us not then aggravate those natural inconveniences by neglect. We have had sufficient instances of this kind already. Sale and Moore will suffice for one age at least. But they are dead, and their sorrows are over." Mr. Foster strangely confounds Edward Moore, the fabulist, with Dr. John Moore, the author of Zeluco. End of footnote. Mrs. Montague's long stay against her own inclination is very convenient. You would, by your own confession, want a companion, and she is par pluribus. Conversing with her, you may find variety in one. London, May 1st, 1780. On the 2nd of May, I wrote to him and requested that we might have another meeting somewhere in the north of England in the autumn of this year. From Mr. Langton I received soon after this time a letter of which I extract a passage relative both to Mr. Beauclerk and Dr. Johnson. The melancholy information you have received concerning Mr. Beauclerk's death is true. Had his talents been directed in any sufficient degree as they ought, I have always been strongly of opinion that they were calculated to make an illustrious figure. And that opinion, as it has been in part formed upon Dr. Johnson's judgment, receives more and more confirmation by hearing what, since his death, Dr. Johnson has said concerning them. A few evenings ago he was at Mr. Vesey's. Footnote. Hannah More, in 1783, describes Mrs. Vesey's pleasant parties. It is a select society which meets at her house every other Tuesday, on the day on which the Turk's Head Club dine together. In the evening they all meet at Mrs. Vesey's, with the addition of such other company as it is difficult to find elsewhere. End of footnote. Where Lord Althorp, who was one of a numerous company there, addressed Dr. Johnson on the subject of Mr. Beauclerk's death, saying, "Our club has had a great loss since we last met." He replied, "A loss that perhaps the whole nation could not repair." The Doctor then went on to speak of his endowments, and particularly extolled the wonderful ease with which he uttered what was highly excellent. He said that no man ever was so free when he was going to say a good thing, from a look that expressed that it was coming, or, when he had said it, from a look that expressed that it had come. At Mr. Thrale's some days before, when we were talking on the same subject, he said, referring to the same idea of his wonderful facility, that Beauclerk's talents were those which he had felt himself more disposed to envy than those of any whom he had known. On the evening I have spoken of above, at Mr. Vesey's, you would have been much gratified, as it exhibited an instance of the high importance in which Dr. Johnson's character is held, I think even beyond any I ever before was witness to. The company consisted chiefly of ladies, among whom were the Duchess Dowager of Portland, the Duchess of Beaufort, whom I suppose from her rank I must name before her mother, Mrs. Boscawen, and her elder sister, Mrs. Lewson, who was likewise there. Lady Lakin, footnote. Horace Walpole wrote on February the 5th, 1781, "I saw Dr. Johnson last night at Lady Lakin's, who had assembled a blue stocking meeting in imitation of Mrs. Vesey's Babels. It was so blue, it was quite mazarine blue." Mrs. Montagu kept aloof from Johnson, like the West from the East. In his letter of January the 14th, the allusion to Mrs. Vesey's Babels is explained. "Mrs. Montagu is one of my principal entertainments at Mrs. Vesey's, who collects all the graduates and candidates for fame, where they vie with one another, till they are as unintelligible as the good folks at Babel." Lady Spencer, said Samuel Rogers, recollected Johnson well, as she used to see him often in her girlhood. Her mother, Lady Lakin, would say, "Nobody dines with us to day, therefore, child, we'll go and get Dr. Johnson." So they would drive to Bolt Court and bring the doctor home with them. "I told Lady Lakin," wrote Johnson on April the 25th, 1780, "how long it was since she sent to me, but she said I must consider how the world rolls about her. She seemed pleased that we met again." End of footnote. Lady Claremont and others of note for their station and understandings. Among the gentlemen were Lord Althorp, whom I have before named, Lord Macartney, Sir Joshua Reynolds, Lord Lucan, Mr. Wraxall, whose book you have probably seen, The Tour to the Northern Parts of Europe, a very agreeable, ingenious man. Footnote. I have seen, wrote Wraxall, the Duchess of Devonshire, then in the first bloom of youth, hanging on the sentences that fell from Johnson's lips, and contending for the nearest place to his chair. All the cynic moroseness of the philosopher and the moralist seemed to dissolve under so flattering an approach. End of footnote. Dr. Warren, Mr. Pepys, the Master in Chancery, whom I believe you know, and Dr. Barnard, the Provost of Eden. Footnote. Dr. Barnard is thus described: in powers of conversation I never yet knew his equal. He saw infinite variety of characters, and, like Shakespeare, adopted them all by turns for comic effect. He carried me to London in a hired chaise. We rose from our seat and put our heads out of the windows while the postboy removed something under us. He supposed himself in the pillory, and addressed the populace against the government with all the cant of No. 45 and Company. He once told me a little anecdote of the original Parson Adams, whom he knew. "Oh, sir," said he to Barnard, almost in a whisper, and with a look of horror, "would you believe it, sir, he was wicked from a boy." Then going up close to him, "You will be shocked, you will not believe it. He wrote God with a little g when he was 10 years old." End of footnote. As soon as Dr. Johnson was come in and had taken a chair, the company began to collect round him, till they became not less than 4, if not 5 deep, those behind standing and listening over the heads of those who were sitting near him. Footnote. The hostess must have suffered, for according to Miss Burney, Lord Harcourt said, "Mrs. Vesey's fear of ceremony is really troublesome, for her eagerness to break a circle is such that she insists upon everybody's sitting with their backs one to another. That is, the chairs are drawn into little parties of 3 together, in a confused manner all over the room." Miss Burney thus describes her: "She has the most wrinkled, sallow, time-beaten face I ever saw. She is an exceeding well-bred woman, and of agreeable manners, but all her name in the world must, I think, have been acquired by her dexterity and skill in selecting parties, and by her address in rendering them easy with one another. She heard her say of a gentleman who had lately died, 'It is a very disagreeable thing, I think, when one has just made acquaintance with anybody and likes them, to have them die.' End of footnote. The conversation for some time was chiefly between Dr. Johnson and the Provost of Eton, while the others contributed occasionally their remarks. Without attempting to detail the particulars of the conversation, which perhaps if I did I should spin my account out to a tedious length, I thought, my dear Sir, this general account of the respect with which our valued friend was attended to might be acceptable. Footnote. Johnson passed over this scene very lightly. "On Sunday evening I was at Mrs. Vesey's, and there was inquiry about my master, but I told them all good. There was Dr. Barnard of Eton, and we made a noise all the evening, and there was Pepys and Wraxall, till I drove him away." Wraxall was perhaps thinking of this evening when he wrote, Those whom he could not always vanquish by the force of his intellect, by the depth and range of his arguments, and by the compass of his gigantic faculties, he silenced by rudeness. And I have myself more than once stood in the predicament which I here describe. Yet no sooner was he withdrawn, and with him had disappeared these personal imperfections, than the sublime attainments of his mind let their full effect on the audience, such the whole assembly might be in some measure esteemed while he was present. End of footnote. To the Reverend Dr. Farmer, May the 25th, 1780, Sir, I know your disposition to second any literary attempt, and therefore venture upon the liberty of entreating you to procure from college or university registers all the dates or other informations which they can supply relating to Ambrose Phillips, Broome, and Gray, who were all of Cambridge, and of whose lives I am to give such accounts as I can gather. Be pleased to forgive this trouble from, Sir, your most humble servant, Samuel Johnson. While Johnson was thus engaged in preparing a delightful literary entertainment for the world, the tranquillity of the metropolis of Great Britain was unexpectedly disturbed by the most horrid series of outrage that ever disgraced a civilized country. A relaxation of some of the severe penal provisions against our fellow subjects of the Catholic communion had been granted by the legislature, with an opposition so inconsiderable that the genuine mildness of Christianity, united with liberal policy, seemed to have become general in this island. Footnote. Among the provisions thus relaxed was one that subjected popish priests or papists keeping school to perpetual imprisonment. Those only enjoyed the benefit of the act who took a very strict test, in which, among other things, they denied the Pope's temporal and civil jurisdiction within this realm. This bill passed both houses without a single negative. It applied only to England. Scotland was alarmed by the report that the Scotch Catholics were in like manner to be relieved. In Edinburgh and Glasgow the Papists suffered from outrageous acts of violence and cruelty, and government did not think it advisable to repress this persecution by force. The success of these Scotch bigots seems to have given the first rise to the Protestant Association in England. How slight the relaxation was in England is shown by Lord Mansfield's charge on Lord George Gordon's trial, where we learn that the Catholics were still subject to all the penalties created in the reigns of Elizabeth, James I, Charles II, and of the first 10 years of William III. Hannah More, 4 years after the riots, wrote, "I have had a great many prints, pamphlets, etc., sent me from Rouen, but unluckily for me, the sender happened to have put a Popish prayer book among my things, which were therefore, by being caught in bad company, all found guilty of Popery at Brighthelmstone, and condemned to be burnt, to my great regret." End of footnote. But a dark and malignant spirit of persecution soon showed itself in an unworthy petition for the repeal of the wise and humane statute. That petition was brought forward by a mob with the evident purpose of intimidation, and was justly rejected. But the attempt was accompanied and followed by such daring violence as is unexampled in history. Of this extraordinary tumult Dr. Johnson has given the following concise, lively, and just account in his Letters to Mrs. Thrale. On Friday the good Protestants met in St. George's Fields at the summons of Lord George Gordon, and marching to Westminster,
insulted the Lords and Commons, who all bore it with great tameness. At night the outrages began by the demolition of the Mass House by Lincoln's Inn. An exact journal of a week's defiance of government I cannot give you. On Monday, Mr. Strahan, who had been insulted, spoke to Lord Mansfield, who had, I think, been insulted too, of the licentiousness of the populace, and his lordship treated it as a very slight irregularity. On Tuesday night they pulled down Fielding's house and burnt his goods in the street. Footnote. On this day, June the 6th, Johnson, writing to Mrs. Thrale at Bath, did not mention the riots. He gives the date very fully: London, No. 8 Bolt Court, Fleet Street, June the 6th, 1780, and adds, "Mind this, and tell Queen C, Miss Thrale, Miss Burney, who was with the Thrales, writes, Dr. Johnson has written to Mrs. Thrale without even mentioning the existence of this mob. Perhaps at this very moment he thinks it a humbug upon the nation, as George Bodens called the Parliament." When Johnson wrote, the mob had not risen to its height of violence. Mrs. Thrale, in her answer, giving the date Bath, 3 o'clock on Saturday morning, June the 10th, 1780, asks, "Oh, my dear sir, was I ever particular in dating a letter before? And is this a time to begin to be particular, when I have been up all night in trembling agitation? Miss Burney is frighted, but she says better times will come. She made me date my letter so, and persists in hoping that 10 years hence we shall all three read it over together and be merry. But perhaps you will ask, who is consternated, as you did about the French invasion?" End of footnote. They had gutted on Monday Sir George Savile's house, but the building was saved. On Tuesday evening, leaving Fielding's ruins, they went to Newgate to demand their companions who had been seized, demolishing the chapel. The keeper could not release them but by the mayor's permission, which he went to ask. At his return he found all the prisoners released, and Newgate in a blaze. They then went to Bloomsbury and fastened upon Lord Mansfield's house, which they pulled down, and as for his goods, they totally burnt them. Footnote. Lord Mansfield's house, wrote Dr. Franklin from Paris, is burnt with all his furniture, pictures, books, and papers. Thus he who approved the burning American houses has had fire brought home to him. End of footnote. They have since gone to Kenwood, but a guard was there before them. They plundered some papists, I think, and burnt a mass house in Moorfields the same night. Footnote. Baretti, in a marginal note on Mass House, says, "So illiberal was Johnson made by religion, that he calls here the chapel a Mass House. Yet he hated the Presbyterians. That was a nasty blot in his character." End of footnote. On Wednesday I walked with Dr. Scott to look at Newgate, and found it in ruins, with the fire yet glowing. As I went by, the Protestants were plundering the Sessions House at the Old Bailey. They were not, I believe, 100, but they did their work at leisure, in full security, without sentinels, without trepidation, as men lawfully employed, in full day. Such is the cowardice of a commercial place. On Wednesday they broke open the Fleet and the King's Bench and the Marshalsea and Wood Street Compter and Clerkenwell Bridewell, and released all the prisoners. Footnote. Horace Walpole this night, June the 7th, wrote, "Yet I assure your Ladyship there is no panic. Lady Aylesbury has been at the play in the Haymarket, and the Duke and my 4 nieces at Ranelagh this evening." The following Monday he wrote, "Mercy on us, we seem to be plunging into the horrors of France in the reigns of Charles VI. and VII. Yet, as extremes meet, there is at this moment amazing insensibility. Within these 4 days I have received 5 applications for tickets to see my house." End of footnote. At night they set fire to the Fleet and to the King's Bench, and I know not how many other places, and one might see the glare of conflagration fill the sky from many parts. The sight was dreadful. Some people were threatened. Mr. Strahan advised me to take care of myself. Such a time of terror you have been happy in not seeing. The King said in council that the magistrates had not done their duty, but that he would do his own, and a proclamation was published directing us to keep our servants within doors, as the peace was now to be preserved by force. The soldiers were sent out to different parts, and the town is now, June the 9th, at quiet. The soldiers are stationed so as to be everywhere within call. There is no longer any body of rioters, and the individuals are hunted to their holes and led to prison. Lord George was last night sent to the Tower. Mr. John Wilkes was this day in my neighbourhood to seize the publisher of a seditious paper. Several chapels have been destroyed, and several inoffensive papists have been plundered, but the high sport was to burn the jails. This was a good rabble trick. The debtors and the criminals were all set at liberty, but of the criminals, as has always happened, many are already retaken, and 2 pirates have surrendered themselves, and it is expected that they will be pardoned. Government now acts again with its proper force, and we are all under the protection of the King and the law. I thought that it would be agreeable to you and my master to have my testimony to the public security, and that you would sleep more quietly when I told you that you are safe. There has indeed been an universal panic, from which the King was the first that recovered. Without the concurrence of his ministers or the assistance of the civil magistrate, he put the soldiers in motion, and saved the town from calamities such as a rabble's government must naturally produce. The public has escaped a very heavy calamity. The rioters attempted the bank on Wednesday night, but in no great number, and, like other thieves, with no great resolution. Jack Wilkes headed the party that drove them away. It is agreed that if they had seized the bank on Tuesday at the height of the panic, when no resistance had been prepared, they might have carried irrecoverably away whatever they had found. Jack, who was always zealous for order and decency, declares that if he be trusted with power, he will not leave a rioter alive. Footnote: George III told Lord Eldon that at a levee he asked Wilkes after his friend Sergeant Glynn. "My friend, sir," says Wilkes to the King, "he is no friend of mine." "Why," said the King, "he was your friend and your counsel in all your trials." "Sir," rejoined Wilkes, "he was my counsel. One must have a counsel. But he was no friend. He loves sedition and licentiousness, which I never delighted in. In fact, sir, he was a Wilkite, which I never was." The King said the confidence and humour of the man made him forget at the moment his impudence. End of footnote. End of section 45.
Section 46 of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kevin Johnson. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 3, by James Boswell, Section 46. There is, however, now no longer any need of heroism or bloodshed. No blue riband is any longer worn. Footnote: Lord George Gordon and his followers, during these outrages, wore blue ribbons in their hats. Malone. Johnson added, all danger here is apparently over, but a little agitation still continues. We frighten one another with 70,000 Scots to come hither with the Dukes of Gordon and Argyle, and eat us, and hang us, or drown us. 2 days later Horace Walpole, after mentioning that Lord George Gordon was in the Tower, continued, what a nation is Scotland, in every reign engendering traitors to the state, and false and pernicious to the kings that favour it the most. National prejudices, I know, are very vulgar, but if there are national characteristics, can one but dislike the soils and climates that concur to produce them? End of footnote. Such was the end of this miserable sedition, from which London was delivered by the magnanimity of the sovereign himself. Whatever some may maintain, I am satisfied that there was no combination or plan, either domestic or foreign, but that the mischief spread by a gradual contagion of frenzy, augmented by the quantities of fermented liquors of which the deluded populace possessed themselves in the course of their depredations. I should think myself very much to blame did I here neglect to do justice to my esteemed friend Mr. Ackerman, the keeper of Newgate, who long discharged a very important trust with an uniform intrepid firmness, and at the same time a tenderness and a liberal charity, which entitle him to be recorded with distinguished honour. Footnote: He died November 19th, 1792, and left about £20,000 accumulated not parsimoniously, but during a very long possession of a profitable office. His father, who was keeper before him, began as a turnkey. Wesley wrote on January 2nd, 1761, of all the seats of woe on this side hell, few, I suppose, exceed or even equal Newgate. If any region of horror could exceed it a few years ago, Newgate in Bristol did. So great was the filth, the stench, the misery, and wickedness which shocked all who had a spark of humanity left. He described a great change for the better which had lately been made in the London Newgate. Perhaps it was due to Ackerman. End of footnote. Upon this occasion, from the timidity and negligence of magistracy on the one hand, and the almost incredible exertions of the mob on the other, the first prison of this great country was laid open, and the prisoners set free. But that Mr. Ackerman, whose house was burnt, would have prevented all this, had proper aid been sent to him in due time, there can be no doubt. Many years ago a fire broke out in the brick part which was built as an addition to the old jail of Newgate. The prisoners were in consternation and tumult, calling out, "We shall be burnt! We shall be burnt! Down with the gate! Down with the gate!" Mr. Ackerman hastened to them, shoot himself at the gate, and having, after some confused vociferation of "Hear him! Hear him!" obtained a silent attention. He then calmly told them that the gate must not go down, that they were under his care, and that they should not be permitted to escape, but that he could assure them they need not be afraid of being burnt, for that the fire was not in the prison properly so called, which was strongly built with stone, and that if they would engage to be quiet, he himself would come in to them, and conduct them to the further end of the building, and would not go out till they gave him leave. To this proposal they agreed, upon which Mr. Ackerman, having first made them fall back from the gate, went in, and with a determined resolution ordered the outer turnkey upon no account to open the gate, even though the prisoners, though he trusted they would not, should break their word, and by force bring himself to order it. "Never mind me," said he, "should that happen." The prisoners peaceably followed him, while he conducted them through passages of which he had the keys, to the extremity of the jail, which was most distant from the fire. Having by this very judicious conduct fully satisfied them that there was no immediate risk, if any at all, he then addressed them thus: "Gentlemen, you are now convinced that I told you true. I have no doubt that the engines will soon extinguish this fire. If they should not, a sufficient guard will come, and you shall all be taken out and lodged in the compters. I assure you, upon my word and honour, that I have not a farthing insured. I have left my house, that I might take care of you. I will keep my promise, and stay with you if you insist upon it, but if you will allow me to go out and look after my family and property, I shall be obliged to you." Struck with his behaviour, they called out, "Master Ackerman, you have done bravely. It was very kind in you. By all means go and take care of your own concerns." He did so accordingly, while they remained, and were all preserved. Johnson has been heard to relate the substance of this story with high praise, in which he was joined by Mr. Burke. My illustrious friend, speaking of Mr. Ackerman's kindness to his prisoners, pronounced this eulogy upon his character: "He who has long had constantly in his view the worst of mankind, and is yet eminent for the humanity of his disposition, must have had it originally in a great degree, and continued to cultivate it very carefully." Footnote: In the Life of Savage, Johnson wrote of the keeper of the Bristol jail: "Virtue is undoubtedly most laudable in that state which makes it most difficult, and therefore the humanity of a jailer certainly deserves this public attestation, and the man whose heart has not been hardened by such an employment may be justly proposed as a pattern of benevolence. If an inscription was once engraved, 'To the honest toll-gatherer,' less honours ought not to be paid to the tender jailer. This keeper, Daguet by name, was one of Whitefield's disciples. In 1739 Whitefield wrote, 'God having given me great favour in the jailer's eyes, I preached a sermon on the penitent thief to the poor prisoners in Newgate.' He began to read prayers and preach to them every day, till the mayor and sheriffs forbade Mr. Daguet to allow him to preach again." End of footnote. In the course of this month my brother David waited upon Dr. Johnson, with the following letter of introduction, which I had taken care should be lying ready on his arrival in London. To Dr. Samuel Johnson, Edinburgh, April 29, 1780. My dear Sir, this will be delivered to you by my brother David on his return from Spain. You will be glad to see the man who vowed to stand by the old castle of Auchinleck with heart, purse, and sword, that romantic family solemnity devised by me, of which you and I talked with complacency upon the spot. I trust that 12 years of absence have not lessened his feudal attachment, and that you will find him worthy of being introduced to your acquaintance. I have the honour to be, with affectionate veneration, my dear Sir, your most faithful, humble servant, James Boswell. Johnson received him very politely, and has thus mentioned him in a letter to Mrs. Thrale: "I have had with me a brother of Boswell's, a Spanish merchant, whom the war has driven from his residence at Valentia. He is gone to see his friends, and will find Scotland but a sorry place after 12 years' residence in a happier climate. He is a very agreeable man, and speaks no Scotch." To Dr. Beattie, at Aberdeen: "Sir, more years than I have any delight to reckon have passed since you and I saw one another. Of this, however, there is no reason for making any reprehensory complaint. Sic fata ferant." Footnote: Meaning his entertaining Memoirs of David Garrick, Esquire, of which Johnson, as Davies informed me, wrote the first sentence, thus giving, as it were, the keynote performance. It is indeed very characteristical of its author, beginning with a maxim and proceeding to illustrate. All excellence has a right to be recorded. I shall therefore think it superfluous to apologize for writing the life of a man who by an uncommon assemblage of private virtues adorned the highest eminence in a public profession. Boswell. End of footnote. But methinks there might pass some small interchange of regard between us. If you say that I ought to have written, I now write, and I write to tell you that I have much kindness for you and Mrs. Beatty, and that I wish your health better and your life long. Try change of air, and come a few degrees southwards. A softer climate may do you both good. Winter is coming on, and London will be warmer, and gayer, and busier, and more fertile of amusement than Aberdeen. My health is better, but that will be little in the balance when I tell you that Mrs. Montague has been very ill, and is, I doubt, now but weakly. Mr. Thrale has been very dangerously disordered, but is much better, and I hope will totally recover. He has withdrawn himself from business the whole summer. Sir Joshua and his sister are well, and Mr. Davies has got great success as an author, generated by the corruption of a bookseller. Footnote. Davies had become bankrupt. Young, in his first epistle to Pope, says, "For bankrupts write when ruined shops are shut, as maggots crawl from out a perished nut." Davies' Memoirs of Garrick, published this spring, reached its third edition by the following year. End of footnote. More news I have not to tell you, and therefore you must be contented with hearing what I know not whether you much wish to hear, that I am, Sir, your most humble servant, Sam Johnson, Bolt Court, Fleet Street, August 21st, 1780. Footnote. I wish he had omitted the suspicion expressed here, though I believe he meant nothing but jocularity, for though he and I differed sometimes in opinion, he well knew how much I loved and revered him. Beatty. End of footnote. To James Boswell, Esquire. Dear Sir, I found you have taken one of your fits of taciturnity, and have resolved not to write till you are written to. It is but a peevish humour, but you shall have your way. I have sat at home in Bolt Court all the summer, thinking to write the Lives, and a great part of the time only thinking. Several of them, however, are done, and I still think to do the rest. Mr. Thrale and his family have, since his illness, passed their time first at Bath, and then at Brighthelmston, but I have been at neither place. I would have gone to Lichfield, if I could have had time, and I might have had time if I had been active, but I have missed much, and done little. In the late disturbances, Mr. Thrale's house and stock were in great danger. The mob was pacified at their first invasion, with about £50 in drink and meat, and at their second were driven away by the soldiers. Footnote. The Thrales fled from Bath, where a riot had broken out, and travelled about the country in alarm for Mr. Thrale's personal safety, as it had been maliciously asserted in a Bath and Bristol paper that he was a papist. End of footnote. Mr. Strachan got a garrison into his house, and maintained them a fortnight. He was so frighted that he removed part of his goods. Mrs. Williams took shelter in the country. I know not whether I shall get a ramble this autumn. Footnote. On May 30 he wrote to Mrs. Thrale, I have been so idle that I know not when I shall get either to you or to any other place, for my resolution is to stay here till the work is finished. I hope, however, to see standing corn in some part of the earth this summer, but I shall hardly smell hay, or suck clover flowers. End of footnote. It is now about the time when we were travelling. I have, however, better health than I had then, and hope you and I may yet shew ourselves on some part of Europe, Asia, or Africa. Footnote. It will no doubt be remarked how he avoids the rebellious land of America, This puts me in mind of an anecdote for which I am obliged to my worthy social friend, Governor Richard Penn. At one of Miss E. Harvey's assemblies, Dr. Johnson was following her up and down the room, upon which Lord Abingdon observed to her, "Your great friend is very fond of you. You can go nowhere without him." "Aye," said she, "he would follow me to any part of the world." "Then," said the Earl, "ask him to go with you to America." Boswell. This lady was the niece of Johnson's friends, the Herveys. Croker. End of footnote. In the meantime, let us play no trick, but keep each other's kindness by all means in our power. The bearer of this is Dr. Dunbar of Aberdeen, who has written and published a very ingenious book, and who I think has a kindness for me, and will, when he knows you, have a kindness for you. Footnote. Essays on the History of Mankind, Boswell. Johnson could scarcely have known that Dunbar was an active opponent of the American War. Mackintosh, who was his pupil, writes of him, "I shall ever be grateful to his memory for having contributed to breathe into my mind a strong spirit of liberty." The younger Coleman, who attended, or rather neglected to attend his lectures, speaks of him as an acute, frosty-faced little Dr. Dunbar, a man of much erudition and great good nature. End of footnote. I suppose your little ladies are grown tall, and your son is become a learned young man. I love them all, and I love your naughty lady, whom I never shall persuade to love me. When the lives are done, I shall send them to complete her collection, but must send them in a paper, as for want of a pattern, I cannot bind them to fit the rest. I am, sir, yours most affectionately, Sam Johnson. London, August 21st, 1780. This year he wrote to a young clergyman in the country the following very excellent letter, which contains valuable advice to divines in general. Footnote. Mr. Seward says that this clergyman was the son of an old and learned friend of his, the Reverend Mr. Hoole, I conjecture. End of footnote. Dear Sir, not many days ago Dr. Lawrence shewed me a letter, in which you make mention of me. I hope therefore you will not be displeased that I endeavour to preserve your good will by some observations which your letter suggested to me. You are afraid of falling into some improprieties in the daily service by reading to an audience that requires no exactness. Your fear, I hope, secures you from danger. They who contract absurd habits are such as have no fear. It is impossible to do the same thing very often without some peculiarity of manner, but that manner may be good or bad, and a little care will at least preserve it from being bad. To make it good, there must, I think, be something of natural or causal felicity, which cannot be taught. Your present method of making your sermons seems very judicious. Few frequent preachers can be supposed to have sermons more their own than yours will be. Take care to register, somewhere or other, the authors from whom your several discourses are borrowed, and do not imagine that you shall always remember even what perhaps you now think it impossible to forget. My advice, however, is that you attempt from time to time an original sermon, and in the labour of composition do not burthen your mind with too much at once. Do not exact from yourself at one effort of excogitation, propriety of thought, and elegance of expression. Invent first, and then embellish. The production of something, where nothing was before, is an act of greater energy than the expansion or decoration of a thing produced. Set down diligently your thoughts as they rise, in the first words that occur, and when you have matter, you will easily give it form. Nor perhaps will this method be always necessary, for by habit your thoughts and diction will flow together. The composition of sermons is not very difficult. The divisions not only help the memory of the hearer, but direct the judgment of the writer. They supply sources of invention, and keep every part in its proper place. What I like least in your letter is your account of the manners of your parish, from which I gather that it has been long neglected by the parson. The Dean of Carlisle, who was then a little rector in Northamptonshire, told me that it might be discerned whether or no there was a clergyman resident in a parish by the civil or savage manner of the people. Such a congregation as yours stands in need of much reformation, and I would not have you think it impossible to reform them. A very savage parish was civilized by a decayed gentlewoman, who came among them to teach a petty school. My learned friend Dr. Wheeler of Oxford, when he was a young man, had the care of a neighbouring parish for £15 a year, which he was never paid, but he counted it a convenience that it compelled him to make a sermon weekly. One woman he could not bring to the communion, and when he reproved or exhorted her, she only answered that she was no scholar. He was advised to set some good woman or man of the parish, a little wiser than herself, to talk to her in a language level to her mind. Such honest, I may call them holy artifices, must be practised by every clergyman, for all means must be tried by which souls may be saved. Talk to your people, however, as much as you can, and you will find that the more frequently you converse with them upon religious subjects, the more willingly they will attend, and the more submissively they will learn. A clergyman's diligence always makes him venerable. I think I have now only to say that in the momentous work you have undertaken, I pray God to bless you. I am, Sir, your most humble servant, Sam Johnson. Bolt Court, August 30th, 1780. My next letters to him were dated August 24th, September 6th, and October 1st, and from them I extract the following passages. My brother David and I find the long-indulged fancy of our comfortable meeting again at Auchinleck so well realized, that it in some degree confirms the pleasing hope of O preclarum diem in a future state. I beg that you may never again harbour a suspicion of my indulging a peevish humour, or playing tricks. You will recollect that when I confessed to you that I had once been intentionally silent to try your regard, I gave you my word and honour that I would not do so again. I rejoice to hear of your good state of health. I pray God to continue it long. I have often said that I would willingly have 10 years added to my life, to have 10 taken from yours. I mean that I would be 10 years older to have you 10 years younger. But let me be thankful for the years during which I have enjoyed your friendship, and please myself with the hopes of enjoying it many years to come in this state of being, trusting always that in another state we shall meet never to be separated. Of this we can form no notion, but the thought, though indistinct, is delightful, when the mind is calm and clear. The riots in London were certainly horrible, but you give me no account of your own situation during the barbarous anarchy. A description of it by Dr. Johnson would be a great painting. You might write another London, a poem. I am charmed with your condescending, affectionate expression. Let us keep each other's kindness by all the means in our power. My revered friend, how elevating is it to my mind that I am found worthy to be a companion to Dr. Samuel Johnson. All that you have said in grateful praise of Mr. Walmsley, I have long thought of you, but we are both Tories, which has a very general influence upon our sentiments. Footnote: unlike Walmsley and Johnson, of whom one was a Whig, the other a Tory, Walmsley was a Whig, wrote Johnson, with all the virulence and malevolence of his party. Yet difference of opinion did not keep us apart. I honoured him, and he endured me. End of footnote. I hope that you will agree to meet me at York about the end of this month, or if you will come to Carlisle, that would be better still, in case the Dean be there. Please to consider that to keep each other's kindness, we should every year have that free and intimate communication of mind, which can be had only when we are together. We should have both our solemn and our pleasant talk. I write now for the 3rd time to tell you that my desire for our meeting this autumn is much increased. I wrote to Squire Godfrey Bosville, my Yorkshire chief, that I should perhaps pay him a visit, as I was to hold a conference with Dr. Johnson at York. I give you my word and honour that I said not a word of his inviting you, but he wrote to me as follows: I need not tell you I shall be happy to see you here the latter end of this month, as you propose, and I shall likewise be in hopes that you will persuade Dr. Johnson to finish the conference here. It will add to the favour of your own company, if you prevail upon such an associate to assist your observations. I have often been entertained with his writings, and I once belonged to a club of which he was a member, and I never spent an evening there, but I heard something from him well worth remembering. We have thus, my dear sir, good comfortable quarters in the neighbourhood of York, where you may be assured we shall be heartily welcome. I pray you then resolve to set out, and let not the year 1780 be a blank in our social calendar, and in that record of wisdom and wit, which I keep with so much diligence to your honour, and the instruction and delight of others. Mr. Thrale had now another contest for the representation in Parliament of the borough of Southwark, and Johnson kindly lent him his assistance by writing advertisements and letters for him. I shall insert one as a specimen. To the worthy electors of the borough of Southwark, gentlemen, a new Parliament being now called, I again solicit the honour of being elected for one of your representatives, and solicit it with the greater confidence, as I am not conscious of having neglected my duty, or of having acted otherwise than as becomes the independent representative of independent constituents, superior to fear, hope, and expectation, who has no private purposes to promote, and whose prosperity is involved in the prosperity of his country. As my recovery from a very severe distemper is not yet perfect, I have declined to attend the hall, and hope an omission so necessary will not be harshly censured. I can only send my respectful wishes, that all your deliberations may tend to the happiness of the kingdom, and the peace of the borough. I am, gentlemen, your most faithful and obedient servant, Henry Thrale. Southwark, September 5th, 1780. On his birthday, Johnson has this note: I am now beginning the 72nd year of my life, with more strength of body and greater vigour of mind than I think is common at that age. Footnote: Miss Burney described an evening spent by Johnson at Dr. Burney's some weeks earlier. He was in high spirits and good humour, talked all the talk, affronted nobody, and delighted everybody. I never saw him more sweet, nor better attended to by his audience. In December she wrote, Dr. Johnson is very gay and sociable and comfortable, and quite as kind to me as ever. A little later she wrote to Mrs. Thrale, Does Dr. Johnson continue gay and good-humoured, and valuing nobody in a morning? End of footnote. But still he complains of sleepless nights and idle days, and forgetfulness, or neglect of resolutions. He thus pathetically expresses himself: Surely I shall not spend my whole life with my own total disapprobation. Mr. Macbean, whom I have mentioned more than once, as one of Johnson's humble friends, a deserving but unfortunate man, being now oppressed by age and poverty, Johnson solicited the Lord Chancellor Thurlow to have him admitted into the Charterhouse. I take the liberty to insert his lordship's answer, as I am eager to embrace every occasion of augmenting the respectable notion which should ever be entertained of my illustrious friend. To Dr. Samuel Johnson, London, October 24th, 1780. Sir, I have this moment received your letter, dated the 19th, and returned from Bath. In the beginning of the summer I placed one in the Chartreux, without the sanction of a recommendation so distinct and so authoritative as yours of Macbean, and I am afraid that according to the establishment of the house, the opportunity of making the charity so good amends will not soon recur. But whenever a vacancy shall happen, if you'll favour me with notice of it, I will try to recommend him to the place, even though it should not be my turn to nominate. I am, sir, with great regard, your most faithful and obedient servant, Thurlow. Footnote: Macbean was, on Lord Thurlow's nomination, admitted a poor brother of the Charterhouse. Johnson, on Macbean's death, on June 26, 1784, wrote, "He was one of those who, as Swift says, stood as a screen between me and death. He has, I hope, made a good exchange. He was very pious. He was very innocent. He did no ill, and of doing good a continual tenor of distress allowed him few opportunities. He was very highly esteemed in the House," the Charterhouse. The quotation from Swift is found in the lines on the death of Dr. Swift. "The fools, my juniors by a year, are tortured with suspense and fear, who wisely thought my age a screen, when death approached to stand between." End of footnote. To James Boswell, Esquire. Dear Sir, I am sorry to write you a letter that will not please you, and yet it is at last what I resolved to do. This year must pass without an interview. The summer has been foolishly lost, like many other of my summers and winters. I hardly saw a green field, but stayed in town to work, without working much. Mr. Thrale's loss of health has lost him the election. Footnote: Johnson in May had persuaded Mrs. Thrale to come up from Bath to canvass for Mr. Thrale. My opinion is that you should come for a week, and show yourself and talk in high terms. Be brisk, and be splendid, and be public. The voters of the borough are too proud and too little dependent to be solicited by deputies. They expect the gratification of seeing the candidate bowing or curtsying before them. If you are proud, they can be sullen. Mr. Thrale certainly shall not come, and yet somebody must appear whom the people think it worth the while to look at. End of footnote. He is now going to Brighthelmston, and expects me to go with him, and how long I shall stay I cannot tell. I do not much like the place, but yet I shall go, and stay while my stay is desired. We must therefore content ourselves with knowing what we know as well as man can know the mind of man, that we love one another, and that we wish each other's happiness, and that the lapse of a year cannot lessen our mutual kindness. I was pleased to be told that I accused Mrs. Boswell unjustly in supposing that she bears me ill will. I love you so much that I would be glad to love all that love you, and that you love, and I have love very ready for Mrs. Boswell, if she thinks it worthy of acceptance. I hope all the young ladies and gentlemen are well. I take a great liking to your brother. He tells me that his father received him kindly, but not fondly. However, you seem to have lived well enough at Auchinleck while you stayed. Make your father as happy as you can. You lately told me of your health. I can tell you in return that my health has been for more than a year past better than it has been for many years before. Perhaps it may please God to give us some time together before we are parted. I am, dear Sir, yours most affectionately, Sam Johnson. October 17th, 1780. End of section 46.
Appendix A to the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pamela Krantz. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 3, by James Boswell. Appendix A. The alehouse in the city where Johnson used to go and sit with George Psalmanazar, Psalmanazar, was no doubt the club in Old Street, where he met also the metaphysical tailor, the uncle of Hoole the poet. Psalmanazar is mentioned a third time by Boswell in a passage borrowed from Hawkins's edition of Johnson's works, where it is stated that Johnson said, he had never seen the close of the life of any one that he wished so much his own to resemble as that of him, for its purity and devotion. He was asked whether he ever contradicted him. "I should as soon," said he, "have thought of contradicting a bishop." When he was asked whether he had ever mentioned Formosa before him, he said, he was afraid to mention even China. We learn from Hawkins' Life of Johnson that Psalmanazar lived in Ironmonger Row, Old Street, in the neighborhood whereof he was so well known and esteemed, that, as Dr. Hawkesworth once told me, scarce any person, even children, passed him without showing him the usual signs of respect. In the list of the writers of the Universal History that Johnson drew up a few days before his death, his name is given as the historian of the Jews, Gauls, and Spaniards. According to Mrs. Piazzi, his pious and patient endurance of a tedious illness, ending in an exemplary death, confirmed the strong impression his merit had made upon the mind of Mr. Johnson. "It is so very difficult," said he always, "for a sick man not to be a scoundrel." Johnson, in Prayers and Meditations, mentions him as a man "whose life was, I think, uniform." Smollett, in Humphrey Clinker, describes him as one who, after having drudged half a century in the literary mill, in all the simplicity and abstinence of an Asiatic, subsists upon the charity of a few booksellers just sufficient to keep him from the parish. A writer in the Annual Register for 1764, speaking of the latter part of his life, says, "He was concerned in compiling and writing works of credit, and lived exemplarily for many years." He died a few days before that memorable 16th day of May, 1763, when Boswell first met Johnson. It is a pity that no record has been kept of the club meetings in Ironmonger Row, for then we should have seen Johnson in a new light. Johnson in an alehouse club, with a metaphysical tailor on one side of him and an aged writer on the other side of him, who spoke English with the city accent and coarsely enough, and whom he would never venture to contradict, is a Johnson that we cannot easily imagine. Of the greater part of Psalmanazar's life we know next to nothing, little, I believe, beyond the few facts that I have here gathered together. His early years he has described in his Memoirs. That he started as one of the most shameless impostors, and that he remained a hypocrite and a cheat till he was full 40, if not indeed longer, his own narrative shows. That for many years he lived laboriously, frugally, and honestly, seems to be no less certain. How far his Memoirs are truthful is somewhat doubtful. In them he certainly confesses the impudent trick which he had played in his youth, when he passed himself off as a Formosan convert. He wished, he writes, to undeceive the world by unraveling that whole mystery of iniquity. He lays bare roguery enough, and in a spirit, it seems, of real sorrow. Nevertheless, there are passages which are not free from the leaven of hypocrisy, and there are, I suspect, statements which are at least partly false. Johnson, indeed, looked upon him as little less than a saint, but then, as Sir Joshua Reynolds tells us, though Johnson was not easily imposed upon by professions to honesty and candor, he appeared to have little suspicion of hypocrisy in religion. It was in the year 1704 that Psalmanazar published his historical and geographical description of Formosa. So gross is the forgery that it almost passes belief that it was widely accepted as a true narrative. He gave himself out as a native of that island and a convert to Christianity. He lied so foolishly as to maintain that in the academies of Formosa Greek was studied. He asserted also that in an island that is only about half as large as Ireland, 18,000 boys were sacrificed every year. But his readers were for the most part only too willing to be deceived. For in Protestant England his abuse of the Jesuits covered a multitude of lies. Ere he had been 3 months in London, he was, he writes, cried up for a prodigy, and not only the domestic, but even the foreign papers had helped to blaze forth many things in his praise. He was aided in his fraud by the Reverend Dr. Innes, or Innes, a clergyman of the English Church, who by means of his interesting convert pushed himself into the notice of Compton, Bishop of London, and before long was made chaplain general to the English forces in Portugal. The same man, as Boswell tells us, by another impudent cheat, a second time obtained considerable promotion. Psalmanazar's book soon reached a second edition, besides the several versions it had abroad. Yet it is very dull reading, just such a piece of work as might be looked for from a young man of little fancy, but gifted with a strong memory. Nevertheless, the author's credit lasted so long that for many years he lived on a subscription which was founded on a belief of his being a Formosan and a real convert to the Church of England. He was even sent to Oxford to study, and had rooms in one of the colleges, Christ Church, if I mistake not. It was not only as a student that he was sent by his dupes to that ancient seat of learning. The Bishop of London hoped that he would teach the Formosan language to a set of gentlemen who were afterwards to go with him to convert those people to Christianity. While he was living the life of a lying scoundrel, he was, he says, happily restrained by divine grace, so that all sense of remorse was not extinguished, and there was no fall into downright infidelity. At length he picked up law's serious call, which moved him, as later on it moved better men. Step by step he got into a way of steady work, and lived henceforth a laborious and honest life. It was in the year 1728, 35 years before his death, that he began, he says, to write the narrative of his imposture. A dangerous illness and the dread of death had deeply moved him, and filled him with the desire of leaving behind a faithful narrative which would undeceive the world. 19 years later, though he did not publish his narrative, he made a public confession of his guilt. In the unsigned article on Formosa, which he wrote in 1747 for Bowen's Complete System of Geography, he says, Psalmanazar, Psalmanaazar, so he had at one time written his name, hath long since ingenuously owned the contrary of the truthfulness of his narrative, though not in so public a manner as he might perhaps have done, had not such an avowment been likely to have affected some few persons who for private ends took advantage of his youthful vanity to encourage him in an imposture which he might otherwise never had the thought, much less the confidence, to have carried on. These persons being now dead, and out of all danger of being hurt by it, he now gives us leave to assure the world that the greatest part of that account was fabulous, and that he designs to leave behind him a faithful account of that unhappy step, and other particulars of his life leading to it, to be published after his death. In his memoirs he will not, he writes, give any account of his real country or family. Yet it is quite clear from his own narrative that he was born in the south of France. His pronunciation of French had, it was said, a spice of the Gascoin accent, and in that provincial dialect he was so masterly that none but those born in the country could excel him. If a town can be found that answers to all that he tells of his birthplace, his whole account may be true, but the circumstances that he mentions seem inconsistent. The city in which he was born was 24 miles from an archiepiscopal city in which there was a college of Jesuits, and about 60 miles from a noble great city full of gentry and nobility, of coaches and all kinds of grandeur, the seat of a great university. When he left the great city for Avignon, he speaks of himself as going down to Avignon. Thence he started on a pilgrimage to Rome, and in order to avoid his native place, after he had gone no great way, he wheeled about to the left, to leave the place at some 20 or 30 miles distance. He changed his mind, however, and returned home. Thence he set off to join his father, who was near 500 miles off in Germany. The direct route was through the great university city and Lyons. His birthplace then, if his account is true, was on the road from Avignon to Rome, 60 miles from a great university city, and southwards of it, for through this university city passed the direct road from his home to Lyons. It was moreover 60 miles from an archiepiscopal city. I do not think that such a place can be found. He says that he thought himself obliged, out of respect to his country and family, to conceal both, it being but too common, though unjust, to censure them for the crimes of private persons. The excuse seems unsatisfactory, for he tells enough to show that he came from the south of France, while for his family there was no need of care. It was, he writes, ancient but decayed, and he was the only surviving child. Of his father and mother he had heard nothing since he started on the career of a pious rogue. They must have been dead very many years by the time his memoirs were given to the world. His story shows that at all events for the first part of his life he had been one of the vainest of men, and vanity is commonly found joined with a love of mystery. He is not consistent, moreover, in his dates. On April 23, 1752, he was in the 73rd year of his age, so that he was born in either 1679 or 1680. When he joined his father he was hardly full 16 years old. Yet it was a few years after the Peace of Ryswick, which was signed on September 22, 1697. He was, he says, but near 20 when he wrote his history of Formosa. This was in the year 1704. With his father he stayed but a short time, and then set out rambling northwards. At Avignon, by shameless lying, he had obtained a pass, as a young student in theology of Irish extract, who had left his country for the sake of religion. It was wonderful that his fraud had escaped detection there, for he had kept his own name, because it had something of quality in it. He now resolved on a more impudent pretense, for passing as an Irishman and a sufferer for religion did not only, he writes, expose me to the danger of being discovered, but came short of the merit and admiration I had expected from it. He thereupon gave himself out as a Japanese convert, and forged a fresh pass, clapping to it the old seal. He went through different adventures, and at last enlisted in the army of the Elector of Cologne, an unhappy herd, destitute of all sense of religion and shamefacedness. He got his discharge, but enlisted a second time, passing himself off for a Japanese and a heathen, under the name of Salmanazar, Salmanazar. Later on he altered it, he says, by the addition of a letter or two, to make it somewhat different from that mentioned in the Book of Kings. In his description of Formosa he wrote it Psalmanaazar, and in later life Psalmanazar. In his vanity he invented an awkward show of worship, turning his face to the rising or setting sun, and pleased to be taken notice of for so doing. He had moreover the ambition of passing for a moral heathen. By way of singularity he next took to living altogether upon raw flesh, roots, and herbs. It was when he was on garrison duty at Sluys that he became acquainted with Innes, who was chaplain to a Scotch regiment that was in the pay of the Dutch. This man found in him a tool ready made to his hand. He had at once seen through his roguery, but he used his knowledge only to plunge him deeper in his guilt. By working on his fears and his vanity, and by small bribes, he induced him to profess himself a convert to the Church of England and to submit to baptism. He brought him over to London and introduced him to the Bishop of London, and to Tenison, Archbishop of Canterbury. Salmanazar spoke Latin fluently, but his Grace had either forgotten his, or being unused to the foreign pronunciation, was forced to have it interpreted to him by Dr. Innes in English. The young impostor everywhere gave himself out as a Formosan who had been entrapped by a Jesuit priest and brought to Avignon. "There I could expect," he wrote, "no mercy from the inquisitors, if I had not in hypocrisy professed their religion." He was kept, he says, in a kind of custody, but I trusted under God to my heels. It was Innes who made him write this history. In the confession of his fraud, Salmanazar seems to keep back nothing. His repentance appears to be sincere, and his later life, there can be little question, was regular. Yet, as I have said, even his confessions apparently are not free from the old leaven of hypocrisy. It is indeed very hard, if not altogether impossible, for a man who has passed 40 years, and more as a lying hypocrite altogether, to clear his mind of cant. In writing of the time when he was still living the life of a lying scoundrel, he says, I have great reason to acknowledge it the greatest mercy that could befall me, that I was so well grounded in the principles and evidence of the Christian religion, that neither the conversation of the then freethinkers, as they loved to style themselves, and by many of whom I was severely attacked, nor the writings of Hobbes, Spinoza, etc., against the truth of divine revelation, could appear to me in any other light than as the vain efforts of a dangerous set of men to overturn a religion, the best founded and most judiciously calculated to promote the peace and happiness of mankind, both temporal and eternal. 2 pages further on, he writes, a little boastfully it seems, of having had some sort of gallantry with the fair sex, with many of whom, even persons of fortune and character, of sense, wit, and learning, I was become, he continues, a great favourite, and might, if I could have overcome my natural sheepishness and fear of a repulse, have been more successful either by way of matrimony or intrigue. He goes on, I may truly say that hardly any man who might have enjoyed so great a variety ever indulged himself in so few instances of the unlawful kind as I have done. He concludes this passage in his writings by thankfully acknowledging that there must have been some secret providence that kept me from giving such way to unlawful amours as I might otherwise have done, to the ruin of my health, circumstances, etc. When he came to wish for an honest way of life, he was beset with difficulties. What a deadly wound, he writes, must such an unexpected confession have given to my natural vanity, and what a mortification would it have been to such sincere honest people as my friends to hear it from my mouth. This was natural enough. That he long hesitated like a coward on the brink is not to be cast in his teeth, seeing that at last he took the plunge. But then, in speaking of the time when he weakly repeated, and to use his own words, as it were confirmed anew, his old falsehoods, he should not have written that, as the assurance of God's mercy gave me good grounds to hope, so that hope inspired me with a design to use all proper means to obtain it, and leave the issue of it to his divine providence. The only proper means to obtain God's mercy was at once to own to all the world that he had lied. It is only the Tartuffes and the Holy Willies who, whilst they persist in their guilt, talk of leaving the issue to the divine providence of God. Since this appendix was in type, I have learnt, through the kindness of Mr. C. E. Doble, the editor of Hearne's Remarks and Collections, edition 1885, that a passage in that book confirms my conjecture that Psalmanazar was lodged in Christ Church when at Oxford. Hearne says, July 9, 1706, Mr. Topping of Christ Church also tells me that Salmanezzer, Salmanezzer, the famous Formosan, when he left Christ Church, where he resided while in Oxon, left behind him a book, wherein a distinct account was given of the consular and imperial coins by himself. Mr. Doble also pointed out to me in the first edition of the Spectator the following passage at the end of number 14. Advertisement. On the 1st of April will be performed at the Playhouse in the Haymarket an opera called The Cruelty of Atreus. Nota bene. The scene wherein Thyestes eats his own children is to be performed by the famous Mr. Salmanazar, Psalmanazar, lately arrived from Formosa, the whole supper being set to kettledrums. End of Appendix A. Recording by Pamela Krantz. Appendix B to the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pamela Krantz. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 3, by James Boswell. Appendix B. Johnson's Travels and Love of Travelling. On the passage in the text Macaulay, in his review of Croker's edition of Boswell's Life of Johnson, partly founds the following criticism. Johnson's visit to the Hebrides introduced him to a state of society completely new to him, and a salutary suspicion of his own deficiencies seems, on that occasion, to have crossed his mind for the first time. He confessed in the last paragraph of his journey that his thoughts on national manners were the thoughts of one who had seen but little, of one who had passed his time almost wholly in cities. This feeling, however, soon passed away. It is remarkable that to the last he entertained a fixed contempt for all those modes of life and those studies which tend to emancipate the mind from the prejudices of a particular age or a particular nation. Of foreign travel and of history he spoke with the fierce and boisterous contempt of ignorance. What does a man learn by traveling? Is Beauclerk the better for traveling? What did Lord Charlemont learn in his travels, except that there was a snake in one of the pyramids of Egypt? In another passage Macaulay says, "Johnson was no master of the great science of human nature. He had studied not the genus man, but the species Londoner. Nobody was ever so thoroughly conversant with all the forms of life and all the shades of moral and intellectual character which were to be seen from Islington to the Thames, and from Hyde Park Corner to Mile End Green. But his philosophy stopped at the first turnpike gate. Of the rural life of England he knew nothing, and he took it for granted that everybody who lived in the country was either stupid or miserable." Of the two assertions that Macaulay makes in these two passages, while one is for the most part true, the other is utterly and grossly false. Johnson had no contempt for foreign travel. That curiosity which animated his eager mind in so many parts of learning did not fail him when his thoughts turned to the great world outside our narrow seas. It was his poverty that confined him so long to the neighborhood of Temple Bar. He must in these early days have sometimes felt with Arviragus when he says, "What should we speak of when we are old as you? When we shall hear the rain and wind beat dark December, how in this pinching cave shall we discourse the freezing hours away? We have seen nothing." With his pension his wanderings at once began. His friendship with the Thrales gave them a still wider range. His curiosity, which in itself was always eager, was checked in his more prosperous circumstances by his years, his natural unwillingness at any one moment to make an effort, and by the want of travelling companions who were animated by a spirit of inquiry and of enterprise equal to his own. He did indeed travel much more than is commonly thought, and was far less frequently to be seen rolling along Fleet Street, or stemming the full tide of human existence at Charing Cross, than his biographers would have us believe. The following table, imperfect though it must necessarily be, shows how large a part of his life he passed outside the first turnpike gate and beyond the smoke of London. 1709 to 1736. The first 27 years of his life he spent in small country towns or villages, Lichfield, Stourbridge, Oxford, Market Bosworth, Birmingham. So late as 1781 Lichfield did not contain 4,000 inhabitants. 8 years later it was reckoned that a little over 8,000 people dwelt in Oxford. In 1732 or 1733 Birmingham, when Johnson first went to live there, had not, I suppose, a population of 10,000. Its growth was wonderfully rapid. Between 1770 and 1797 its inhabitants increased from 30,000 to nearly 80,000. 1736 to 7. The first 18 months of his married life he lived quite in the country at Edial, 2 miles from Lichfield. 1737. He was 28 years old when he removed to London. 1739. He paid a visit to Appleby in Leicestershire and to Ashbourne. 1754. Oxford, July and August, about 5 weeks. 1759. Oxford, July, length of visit not mentioned. 1761 to 2. Lichfield, winter, a visit of 5 days. 1762. In the summer of this year his pension was granted, and he henceforth had the means of travelling. A trip to Devonshire from August 16 to September 26, 6 weeks. Oxford, December. I am going for a few days or weeks to Oxford. Letter of December 21, 1762. 1763, Harwich, August, a few days. Oxford, October, length of visit not mentioned, a letter dated Oxford, October 27, 1763. 1764, Langton in Lincolnshire, part of January and February. Easton Maudit in Northamptonshire, part of June, July, and August. Oxford, October, letter to Mr. Strahan, dated Oxford, October 24, 1764. Either this year or the next, Johnson made the acquaintance of the Thrales. For the next 17 years he had an apartment appropriated to him in the Thrales villa at Streatham, a handsome house that stood in a small park. Streatham was a quiet country village, separated by wide commons from London, on one of which a highwayman had been hanged who had there robbed Mr. Thrale. According to Mrs. Piozzi, Johnson commonly spent the middle of the week at their house, coming on the Monday night and returning to his own home on the Saturday. Miss Burney, in 1778, describes him as living almost wholly at Streatham. No doubt she was speaking chiefly of the summer half of the year, for in the winter time the Thrales would be often in their town house, where he also had his apartment. Mr. Strahan complained of his being at Streatham, in a great measure absorbed from the society of his old friends. He used to call it "my home." 1765, Cambridge, early in the year, a short visit. Brighton, autumn, a short visit. 1766, Streatham, summer and autumn, more than 3 months. Oxford, autumn, a month. 1767, Lichfield, summer and autumn, near 6 months. 1768, Oxford, spring, several weeks. Town Malling in Kent, September, apparently a short visit. 1769, Oxford, from at least May 18 to July 7. Lichfield and Ashbourne, August, a short visit. Brighton, part of August and September, some weeks. 1770, Lichfield and Ashbourne, apparently whole of July. 1771, Lichfield and Ashbourne, from June 20 to after August 5. 1772, Lichfield and Ashbourne, from about October 15 to early in December. 1773, Oxford, April, a hurried visit. Tour to Scotland from August 6 to November 26. Oxford, part of November and December. 1774, tour to North Wales, Derbyshire, Chester, Conway, Anglesey, Snowdon, Shrewsbury, Worcester, Birmingham, Oxford, Beaconsfield, from July 5 to September 30. 1775, Oxford, March, a short visit. Oxford, Lichfield, Ashbourne, from end of May till sometime in August. Brighton, apparently a brief visit in September. A tour to Paris, going from Calais and Rouen, and returning by Compiègne, St. Quentin, and Calais, from September 15 to November 12. 1776, Oxford, Lichfield, Ashbourne, March 19 to 29. The trip was cut short by young Thrale's death. Bath, from the middle of April to the beginning of May. Brighton, part of September and October, full 7 weeks. 1777, Oxford, Lichfield, and Ashbourne, from about July 28 to about November 6. Brighton, November, a visit of 3 days. 1778, Warley Camp, in Essex, September, about a week. 1779, Lichfield, Ashbourne, from May 20 to end of June. Epsom, September, a few days. 1780, Brighton, October. 1781, Oxford, Birmingham, Lichfield, Ashbourne, from October 15 to December 11. 1782, Oxford, June, about 10 days. Brighton, part of October and November. 1783, Rochester, July, about a fortnight. Heale, near Salisbury, part of August and September, 3 weeks. 1784, Oxford, June, a fortnight. Lichfield, Ashbourne, Oxford, from July 13 to November 16. That he was always eager to see the world is shown by many a passage in his writings, and by the testimony of his biographers. How Macaulay, who knew his Boswell so well, could have accused him of speaking of foreign travel with the fierce and boisterous contempt of ignorance, would be a puzzle indeed, did we not know how often this great rhetorician was by the stream of his own mighty rhetoric swept far away from the unadorned strand of naked truth. To his unjust and insulting attack I shall content myself with opposing the following extracts, which with some trouble I have collected. 1728 or 1729. Johnson, in his undergraduate days, was one day overheard saying, "I have a mind to see what is done in other places of learning. I'll go and visit the universities abroad. I'll go to France and Italy. I'll go to Padua." 1734. A generous and elevated mind is distinguished by nothing more certainly than an eminent degree of curiosity, nor is that curiosity ever more agreeably or usefully employed than in examining the laws and customs of foreign nations. 1751. Curiosity is one of the permanent and certain characteristics of a vigorous intellect. Curiosity is in great and generous minds the first passion and the last, and perhaps always predominates in proportion to the strength of the contemplative faculties. 1752. Francis Barber, describing Johnson's friends in 1752, says, "There was a talk of his going to Iceland with Mr. Diamond, which would probably have happened had he lived." Johnson, in a letter to the wife of the poet Smart, says, "We have often talked of a voyage to Iceland." Mrs. Thrale wrote to him when he was in the Hebrides in 1773, "Well, 'tis better talk of Iceland. Gregory challenges you for an Iceland expedition, but I trust there is no need. I suppose good eyes might reach it from some of the places you have been in." 1761. Johnson wrote to Baretti, "I wish you had stayed longer in Spain, for no country is less known to the rest of Europe." He twice recommended Boswell to perambulate Spain. 1763. "Dr. Johnson flattered me (Boswell) with some hopes that he would, in the course of the following summer, come over to Holland, and accompany me in a tour through the Netherlands." 1772. He said that he had had some desire, though he soon laid it aside, to go on an expedition round the world with Mr. Banks and Dr. Solander. 1773. Dr. Johnson and I talked of going to Sweden. On September 9, 1777, Boswell wrote to Johnson, "I shrink a little from our scheme of going up the Baltic. I am sorry you have already been in Wales, for I wish to see it." 4 days later Johnson wrote to Mrs. Thrale, "Boswell shrinks from the Baltic expedition, which I think is the best scheme in our power. What we shall substitute I know not. He wants to see Wales, but except the woods of Bachycray, what is there in Wales that can fill the hunger of ignorance, or quench the thirst of curiosity? We may perhaps form some scheme or other, but in the phrase of Hockley in the Whole, it is a pity he has not a better bottom." Boswell writes, "Martin's account of the Hebrides had impressed us with a notion that we might there contemplate a system of life almost totally different from what we had been accustomed to see. Dr. Johnson told me that his father put Martin's account into his hands when he was very young, and that he was much pleased with it." From the Hebrides Johnson wrote to Mrs. Thrale, "I have a desire to instruct myself in the whole system of pastoral life, but I know not whether I shall be able to perfect the idea. However, I have many pictures in my mind which I could not have had without this journey, and should have passed it with great pleasure had you and Master and Queenie been in the party. We should have excited the attention and enlarged the observation of each other, and obtained many pleasing topics of future conversation. We travelled with very little light in a storm of wind and rain. We passed about 55 streams that crossed our way, and fell into a river that for a very great part of our road foamed and roared beside us. All the rougher powers of nature except thunder were in motion, but there was no danger. I should have been sorry to have missed any of the inconveniencies, to have had it more light or less rain, for their cooperation crowded the scene and filled the mind." See Post, version 334, for the splendid passage in which, describing the emotions raised in his mind by the sight of Iona, he says, "Whatever withdraws us from the power of our senses, whatever makes the past, the distant, or the future predominate over the present, advances us in the dignity of thinking beings. That man is little to be envied whose patriotism would not gain force upon the plains of Marathon, or whose piety would not grow warmer among the ruins of Iona." Macaulay seems to have had the echo of these lines still in his ear when he described imagination as that noble faculty whereby man is able to live in the past and in the future, in the distant and in the unreal. 1774. When he saw some copper and iron works in Wales, he wrote, "I have enlarged my notions." His letter to Warren Hastings shows his curiosity about India. 1775. The Thrales had just received a sum of £14,000. Johnson wrote to Mrs. Thrale, "If I had money enough, what would I do? Perhaps, if you and master did not hold me, I might go to Cairo, and down the Red Sea to Bengal, and take a ramble to India. Would this be better than building and planting? It would surely give more variety to the eye, and more amplitude to the mind. Half 14,000 would send me out to see other forms of existence, and bring me back to describe them. Regions mountainous and wild, thinly inhabited and little cultivated, make a great part of the earth, and he that has never seen them must live unacquainted with much of the face of nature, and with one of the great scenes of human existence. All travel has its advantages. If the traveller visits better countries, he may learn to improve his own, and if fortune carries him to worse, he may learn to enjoy it." To Dr. Taylor he wrote, "I came back last Tuesday from France. Is not mine a kind of life turned upside down? Fixed to a spot when I was young, and roving the world when others are contriving to sit still, I am wholly unsettled. I am a kind of ship with a wide sail, and without an anchor." 1776. In the spring of this year everything was settled for his journey to Italy with the Thrales. Hannah More wrote, "Johnson and Mr. Boswell have this day set out for Oxford, Lichfield, etc., that the Doctor may take leave of all his old friends previous to his great expedition across the Alps. I lament his undertaking such a journey at this time of life, with beginning infirmities. I hope he will not leave his bones on classic grounds." Boswell tells how, speaking with a tone of animation, Johnson said, "We must, to be sure, see Rome, Naples, Florence, and Venice, and as much more as we can." When the journey was put off by the sudden death of Mr. Thrale's son, Boswell wrote, "I perceived that he had so warmly cherished the hope of enjoying classical scenes that he could not easily part with the scheme, for he said, 'I shall probably contrive to get to Italy some other way.'" A day later Boswell wrote, "A journey to Italy was still in his thoughts. He said, 'A man who has not been in Italy is always conscious of an inferiority, from his not having seen what it is expected a man should see. The grand object of travelling is to see the shores of the Mediterranean.' Johnson's desire to go abroad, particularly to see Italy, was very great, and he had a longing wish, too, to leave some Latin verses at the Grand Chartreux. He loved, indeed, the very act of travelling. He was, in some respects, an admirable companion on the road, as he piqued himself upon feeling no inconvenience, and on despising no accommodations." Johnson this same year, speaking of a friend who had gone to the East Indies, said, "I had some intention of accompanying him. Had I thought then as I do now, I should have gone." According to Mr. Tyers, he once offered to attend another friend to India. Moreover, he talked much of travelling into Poland, to observe the life of the Palatines, the account of which struck his curiosity very much. 1777. Boswell wrote to Johnson this year, "You have, I believe, seen all the cathedrals in England except that of Carlisle." This was not the case, yet most of them he had already seen or lived to see. With Lichfield, Oxford, and London he was familiar. Winchester and Exeter he had seen in 1762 on his tour to Devonshire. Peterborough, Ely, Lincoln, York, and Durham he no doubt saw in 1773 on his way to Scotland. The first three he might also have seen in 1764 on his visit to Langton. Chester, St. Asaph, Bangor, and Worcester he visited in 1774 in his journey to Wales. Through Canterbury he almost certainly passed in 1775 on his way to France. Bristol he saw in 1776. To Chichester he drove from Brighton in 1782. Rochester and Salisbury he visited in the summer of 1783. Wells he might easily have seen when he was at Bath in 1776, and possibly Gloucester. Through Norwich he perhaps came on his return from Lincolnshire in 1764. Hereford, I think, he could not have visited. When in the September of this year Johnson and Boswell were driving in Dr. Taylor's chaise to Derby, Johnson strongly expressed his love of driving fast in a post chaise. "If," said he, "I had no duties and no reference to futurity, I would spend my life in driving briskly in a post chaise with a pretty woman, but she should be one who could understand me, and would add something to the conversation." He had previously said, as he was driven rapidly along in a post chaise, "Life is not many things better than this." 1778. Boswell wrote to Johnson, "My wife is so different from you and me that she dislikes travelling." Later on in the year Boswell records, "Dr. Johnson expressed a particular enthusiasm with respect to visiting the Wall of China. I catched it for the moment, and said I really believed I should go and see the Wall of China, had I not children, of whom it was my duty to take care. 'Sir,' said he, 'by doing so you would do what would be of importance in raising your children to eminence. There would be a lustre reflected upon them from your spirit and curiosity. They would be at all times regarded as the children of a man who had gone to view the Wall of China. I am serious, sir.'" 1780. In August he wrote to Boswell, "I know not whether I shall get a ramble this summer. I hope you and I may yet show ourselves on some part of Europe, Asia, or Africa." In the same year Johnson wrote to Mrs. Thrale, "I hope you have no design of stealing away to Italy before the election, nor of leaving me behind you, though I am not only 70, but 71. On October 17 he wrote, "The summer has been foolishly lost, like many other of my summers and winters. I hardly saw a green field, but stayed in town to work, without working much." 1784. Johnson's wish to go to Italy in the last year of his life was caused by the hope that it might be good for his health. "I do not," he wrote, "travel for pleasure or curiosity, yet if I should recover," he added, "curiosity would revive." Mrs. Piazzi, without however giving the year, records, "Dr. Johnson was very angry with a gentleman at our house for not being better company, and urged that he had travelled into Bohemia and seen Prague. 'Surely,' added he, 'the man who has seen Prague might tell us something new and something strange, and not sit silent for want of matter to put his lips in motion.'" All these passages show, what indeed is evident enough from the text, that it was not travelling in general, but travelling between the ages of 19 and 24, with a character unformed, a memory unstored, and a judgment untrained, that Johnson attacked. It was a common habit in his day to send young men of fortune to make the tour of Europe, as it was called, at an age when they would now be sent to either Oxford or Cambridge. Lord Charlemont was but 18 when he left England. Locke, at the end of his work on education, said in 1692 much the same as Johnson said in 1778. "The ordinary time of travel," he wrote, "is from 16 to 21. He would send any one either at a younger age than 16 under a tutor, or at an older age than 21 without a tutor, when he is of age to govern himself, and make observations of what he finds in other countries worthy his notice; and when, too, being thoroughly acquainted with the laws and fashions, the natural and moral advantages and defects of his own country, he has something to exchange with those abroad, from whose conversation he hoped to reap any knowledge." Goldsmith, in his Present State of Polite Learning, wrote in 1759, "We see more of the world by travel, but more of human nature by remaining at home. A youth just landed at the Brille resembles a clown at a puppet show, carries his amazement from one miracle to another, from this cabinet of curiosities to that collection of pictures. But wondering is not the way to grow wise. The greatest advantages which result to youth from travel are an easy address, the shaking off national prejudices, and the finding nothing ridiculous in national peculiarities. The time spent in these acquisitions could have been more usefully employed at home. Gibbon says that the previous and indispensable requisites of foreign travel are age, judgment, a competent knowledge of men and books, and a freedom from domestic prejudices." When he was only 18 years old, he saw the evils of early traveling. "I never liked young travelers. They go too raw to make any great remarks, and they lose a time which is, in my opinion, the most precious part of a man's life." Cowper, in his Progress of Error, describes how "his stock a few French phrases got by heart, with much to learn and nothing to impart. The youth, obedient to his sire's commands, sets off a wanderer into foreign lands. Returning, he proclaims by many a grace, by shrugs and strange contortions of his face, how much a dunce that has been sent to Rome excels a dunce that has been kept at home." End of Appendix B. Recording by Pamela Krantz.
Appendix C to the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gonzales. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 3, by James Boswell. Appendix C. Election of Lord Mayors of London. In the year 1751 to 2 and 3, the Lord Mayor was not appointed by rotation. Sir G. Champion, the senior alderman, being accused of leaning towards Spain. From 1754 to 1765 inclusive, if there was in any year a contest, yet in each case the senior alderman nominated was chosen. From 1766 to 1775 inclusive, there was in every year a departure from the order of seniority. In 1776 to 8, the order of seniority was again observed, so that 2 years before Johnson made this remark in irregularity had come to an end. This information I owe to the kindness of Mr. Scott, the excellent chamberlain of the city. Sir George Champion had been passed over in the year 1739 also. In an address to the liveryman he says that "the disorders and great disturbance to the peace of the city, which in former times had been occasioned by the over-eagerness of some, too ambitious and impatient to obtain this great honour, had been quieted by the adoption of the order of seniority." Among the Lord Mayors from 1769 to 1775 inclusive, we find Beckford, Trecothick, Crosby, Townshend, Ball, Wilkes, and Sawbridge. Where did Beckford and Trecothick learn English? asked Johnson. Crosby, in the year of his mayoralty, 1770-1, was committed to the Tower by the House of Commons for having self-committed to prison a messenger of the House when attempting to arrest the printer of the London evening debates, who was accused of a breach of privilege in reporting the debates. Townshend in the same year refused to pay the land tax, on the plea that his county, Middlesex, was no longer represented, as Wilkes' election had been annulled. Bull in the House of Commons violently attacked Lord North's ministry. Sawbridge, year after year, brought into Parliament a bill for shortening the duration of Parliaments. During his mayoralty he would not suffer the press gangs to enter the city. Among the aldermen, the court party had a majority. In April 1769, Wilkes' eligibility for election as an alderman was not allowed by a majority of 10 to 6. On his release from prison in 1770 he was, however, admitted without a division. When, in March 1770, the city presented an outspoken remonstrance to the king, 16 aldermen protested against it. About this time there arose a great division of popular party in the city. According to Lord Albemarle, in his Memoirs of Rockingham, from the period of his struggle, the Whigs and what are now called Radicals became two distinct sections of the Liberal party. Townshend, who in this followed the lead of Lord Shelburne, headed the more moderate man against Wilkes. The result was that in 1771 each section running a candidate for the mayoralty, a third man, Nash, who was opposed to both, was returned. The livery, for the time at least, was Wilkite. Wilkes' name was sent up to the Lord Mayor at the top of the list in 1772 and 1773, but he was in each case passed over by the Court of Aldermen. It was not till 1774 that he was elected by a kind of Hobson's choice. The aldermen had to choose between him and retiring Lord Mayor, Ball, Walpole, writing of November 1776, says the new Lord Mayor invited the ministers to his feast, to which they had not been asked for 7 years. End of Appendix C. Recording by Gonzales in Cavite, Philippines. Appendix D to the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gonzales. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 3, by James Boswell. Appendix D. The Inmates of Johnson's House. In September of this year, 1778, Miss Benner records the following conversation at Streatham. Mrs. Thrale. Pray, sir, how does Mrs. William like all this tribe? Dr. J. Madam, she does not like them at all, but their fondness for her is not greater. She and Desmoulins quarrel incessantly, but, as they can both be occasionally of service to each other, and as neither of them have any other place to go to, their animosity does not force them to separate. Mr. T. And pray who is clerk of the kitchen, sir? Dr. J. Why, sir, I am afraid there is none. A general anarchy prevails in my kitchen, as I am told by Mr. Levitt, who says it is not now what it used to be. Mrs. G. Mr. Levitt, I suppose, sir, has the office of keeping to the hospital in health, for he is an apothecary. Dr. J. Levitt, madam, is a brutal fellow, but I have a good regard for him, for his brutality is in his manners, not his mind. Mr. T. But how do you know to get your dinner dressed? Dr. J. Why, Desmoulins has cheap management of the kitchen, but our roasting is not magnificent, for we have no jack. Mr. T. No jack? Why, how do they manage without? Dr. J. Small joints, I believe, they manage with a string, and larger are done at the tavern. I have some thoughts with profound gravity of buying a jack, because I think a jack is some credit to a house. Mr. T. Well, but you'll have a spit too. Dr. J. No, sir, no, that would be superfluous, for we shall never use it, and if a jack is seen, a spit will be presumed. Mrs. T. But pray, sir, who is the Pole you talk of? She that used to obey you in her quarrels with Mrs. Williams and call out at her again. Pole never flinch Pole. Dr. J. Why, I took to Pole very well at first, but she won't do upon a nearer examination. Mrs. G. How came she among you, sir? Dr. J. Why, I don't rightly remember, but we could spare her very well from us. Pole's a stupid slut, and I have some hopes of her at first, but when I talked to her tightly and closely, I could make nothing of her. She was wiggle-waggle, and I could never persuade her to be categorical. More than a year later, Johnson wrote to Mrs. Thrale. This court keeps a residence in its habitation, but she has for some time been silent. We have much malice, but no mischief. Levitt is rather a friend to Williams, because he hates Desmoulins more. A thing that he should hate more than Desmoulins is not to be found. Mrs. Piozzi says, he really was oftentimes afraid of going home, because he was so sure to be met at the door with numberless complaints, and he used to lament pathetically to me that they made his life miserable, from the impossibility he found of making theirs happy, when every favour he bestowed on one was wormwood to the rest. If, however, I ventured to blame their ingratitude, and condemn their conduct, he would instantly set at softening the one and justifying the other, and finish commonly by telling me that I knew not how to make allowances for situations I never experienced. Hawkins says, almost throughout Johnson's life, poverty and distress circumstances seemed to be the strongest of all recommendations to his favour. When asked by one of his intimate friends how he could bear to be surrounded by such necessitous and undeserving people as he had about him, his answer was, if I didn't assist them, no one else would, and they must be lost for want. His humanity and generosity in proportion to his slender income were, writes Murphy, unbounded. He has to be truly said that the lame, the blind, and the sorrowful found in his house a sure retreat. At the same time it must be remembered that while Mrs. Desmoulins and Mrs. Carmichael only brought trouble into the house, In the society of Mrs. Williams and Leavitt he had real pleasure. End of Appendix D and End of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 3, by James Boswell. Recording by Gonzales in Cavite, Philippines.